The dawn came to Dry Arrow Basin not as a light, but as a wound. The sky over Redwater Crossing was a deep, angry purple, bruised by the alkali dust that hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. It was a silence you could taste, gritty and bitter. Then came the sound. It was the dry scrape of boot leather on packed earth, and the rhythmic, metallic clink-drag of heavy iron. Juniper Vale was being hauled through the center of town. She was 22 years old, though the past few days had carved another decade onto her face. The chains linking her wrists were forge-blackened and heavy enough for a draft horse. Sheriff Burke Maddox held the trailing end, his thick fist wrapped in the links, using her as an anchor against his own heavy-shouldered gait. He wasn't just escorting her, he was displaying her. The town woke up to the spectacle. One by one, doors opened. Faces appeared in the dusty windows of the mercantile and the assay office. Men paused on the boardwalks, thumbs hooked in their suspenders. The whispers started low, a dry rustle like snakes in the greasewood. "That's her." The Vale girl, the one worked for Hadley. Barn burner, heard she lit the match herself. Took the whole north pasture line, 50 head of prime stock, gone. Juniper heard them. She felt the eyes on her, sharp as splintered glass. Her dress, a cheap calico, was torn at the shoulder and smeared with soot. Her hair, the color of wet straw, was matted with grime. There were dark, hollow bruises under her eyes, the kind that came from zero sleep and too much fear. But her spine was straight. She did not look at the faces. She did not stumble. Though Maddox yanked the chain hard enough to make her, she kept her chin level with the horizon, focusing on the sliver of bruised dawn visible between the false front of the saloon and the gunsmith's shop. She locked her jaw against the rattling chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Silence was the only armor she had left. Maddox, enjoying the audience, stopped dead in the center of the street. The abrupt halt sent Juniper pitching forward, the chains biting viciously into her wrists. She caught herself before she fell to her knees. Further down the street, standing apart from the clutch of onlookers, a man watched. He was separate, leaning against a support beam of the feed store's covered porch, half hidden in the long morning shadow. His name was Cassian Rourke. He owned the Larkspur Ridge, a hard-luck ranch up on the high mesa. And he was not a man built for towns. His coat was dusted with the pale gold of oat straw, and the cuffs of his denim trousers were frayed. He was lean, quiet, and weathered to the color of old leather. His hands, resting on the rail, were split and calloused. The knuckles thickened the hands of a man who spoke mostly to animals and unbroken land, and who did everything for himself. He watched the girl, but he wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands. Sheriff Burke Maddox cleared his throat, a sound like gravel rolling in a dry creek bed. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from Juniper's boot. "This here," he boomed, projecting his voice to the windows, "is Juniper Vale, caught red-handed, conspiring with that raiding trash to burn out Eustace Hadley." A collective gasp from the cluster of church-going women near the mercantile. "She's a menace," Maddox continued, shaking the chain for effect. "And Redwater Crossing won't abide it. I got the writ." He fumbled in his coat and produced a piece of paper, waving it like a captured flag. "Signed by Judge Orville Pike himself. Not an hour ago. She ain't staying in my jail. She's bound for the state quarry on the 5 o'clock train. She can learn about consequences breaking rocks for the next 10 years. The rock quarry. The words hit the small crowd like a physical blow. It was a sentence reserved for hardened killers, not a 22-year-old girl. Juniper's shoulders tensed, the first crack in her composure. The quarry was a place you went to die. From the shadows of the porch, Cassian Rourke's eyes narrowed. He shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on the girl's dress. The rumor was arson a lantern. They said she'd been careless or malicious and dropped a lantern in the dry hay of the Hadley stockyards. But Cassian knew fire. He'd fought prairie fires, seen lightning strikes, and tended his own hearth. He knew what kerosene looked like when it burned on cloth. It left a greasy, spreading stain, a bloom of black char. The mark on Juniper's skirt, near the hem, wasn't that? It was a sharp, angry-looking burn, almost surgical in its neatness, as if a hot poker had been laid against the fabric. It was white-gray at the edges, not oily black. It didn't look like a splash from a dropped lantern. It looked like something else entirely. Something hotter, or faster. It was a detail that didn't fit the story Maddox was selling. Juniper, feeling the finality of the sheriff's proclamation, finally broke her forward stare. Her eyes swept the crowd. It was a desperate, animal-quick search. She wasn't looking for pity. She was looking for one person who wasn't staring at her like she was a viper in a jar. She saw only disgust, fearful curiosity, and the righteous anger of people glad it wasn't them. Then her gaze locked with Cassian Rourke's. He didn't look away. He didn't offer a kind smile or a nod of support. His expression was flat, unreadable, almost cold. He was just watching. His eyes were gray as a winter sky, and they held no judgment at all. It was the absence of condemnation that struck her, the simple, assessing quiet of his gaze. It was the first time in 2 days a man had looked at her and not already decided who she was. The moment was broken by a nervous cough. May Albright, who ran the town's only decent boarding house, stepped hesitantly off the boardwalk. She was wringing her hands in her apron. "Sheriff," May said, her voice thin but clear. "Sheriff Maddox, if you please. The quarry. For a barn fire, it just seems severe. Was anyone hurt in the blaze?" Burke Maddox turned on her, his face, already florid, darkened to a dull brick red. "You questioning the judiciary. May Orville Pike signed the writ. That's the law." "I'm just asking," May persisted, though she took a step back. "She's just a girl. It don't seem right, dragging her like this." "You want to be charged with interfering, May," Maddox snarled, taking a step toward her. "You want to spend a night in the cell, go on back to your biscuits. This ain't your concern." May flushed, her eyes dropping, and she retreated. The small bubble of dissent burst. The crowd went silent again, convinced the matter was closed. Clink, clink. The sound was sharp in the sudden quiet. It wasn't the sound of chains. It was the sound of coins. Gold eagles, hitting the wooden desk in the sheriff's office, which doubled as the judge's courtroom. Every head turned. Cassian Rourke had moved. He had come from the shadows of the feed store, walking with that same deliberate, unhurried pace, and had entered the office behind the sheriff. Judge Orville Pike, a small, nervous man who always looked like he'd just woken up, was sitting at the desk, blotting the ink on the very warrant Maddox held. Cassian stood before the desk. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd simply placed a small, heavy leather poke on the blotter. Then he'd emptied it. 10, 11. 12 gold coins spun and settled. Alongside them, he placed a folded piece of paper, the deed to Larkspur Ridge. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" "Rourke," Burke Maddox bellowed, stomping onto the boardwalk and into his own office. Cassian didn't look at the sheriff. He spoke directly to the judge, his voice low and rough, like stones dragging. "Bail," he said. Judge Pike looked up, his eyes wide and panicked. "Bail, Sheriff. You said this was a transport warrant." "It is," Maddox snapped. "It's a holding warrant until trial," Cassian corrected him, his voice still quiet, but cutting through the sheriff's bluster. "She ain't been tried. She ain't been convicted. She's accused, by county law. She's entitled to surety." "Surety," Maddox laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "On a charge this big, who'd be fool enough?" "I am," Cassian said. "That's $200 in gold, and the deed is the bond. I'm posting her bail." The silence in the street was absolute. $200 was more money than most of these people saw in a year. It was the price of a small herd. Judge Pike swallowed, looking at the gold. His eyes darted nervously to Burke. "Sheriff, the law, the statute does allow for a surety bond, provided the citizen is of standing." Rourke Maddox scoffed. "He's a dirt scratcher with a half-burned ranch." "He's a landowner," Pike whispered, his hands visibly shaking as he looked at the deed. "He's good for it. Burke, my hands are tied. It's the law." Burke Maddox looked like he was about to explode. His face was mottled with rage, his hand gripping the chain so tightly his knuckles were white. He stared at Cassian, his eyes promising violence. Cassian ignored him. He stepped back out onto the boardwalk, walking directly to where Juniper stood, still tethered, still frozen. The crowd parted around him. He stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at the chains, then at her face. Juniper flinched, expecting a blow or a demand. Cassian leaned in, close enough that his breath stirred the matted hair at her temple. He spoke so low, only she and the sheriff, who was right behind him, could hear. "You're mine now, girl," he whispered. The words were hard, possessive, a claim of ownership. "In the eyes of the law, you belong to me until that trial date. I'm responsible for you." He paused, his gray eyes flicking to the fuming sheriff just over her shoulder. "Unless, of course," Cassian added, his voice dropping even lower, "you want to break the law you're sworn to uphold." "Sheriff." It was a challenge, a direct, public, and inescapable one. Burke Maddox vibrated with fury. He wanted to draw his pistol. He wanted to strike the man, but he was trapped. The entire town, Judge Pike, and the statutes of the territory were all staring at him. To deny a legal, paid bond, especially one backed by land, would be an overreach so severe he could lose his badge. And Cassian Rourke, though quiet, was not a man you crossed lightly. Everyone knew he'd held Larkspur Ridge alone against drought, raiders, and a hard winter. With a growl that sounded ripped from his throat, Maddox threw his keys at the boardwalk. "Fine," he spat. "Unlock her." He looked at Juniper with pure hatred. "She's your problem, Rourke. She misses that court date. I'm coming for your ranch, and I will enjoy it." Cassian bent, retrieved the keys, and stepped up to Juniper. She instinctively recoiled, but he only moved to her wrists. He found the keyhole. The iron lock was cold. He worked it for a moment, the mechanism stiff with rust. There was a loud, metallic thunk. He pulled the heavy iron shackle from one wrist. Juniper gasped, a small, sharp intake of air, as the weight fell away. He moved to the other. Thunk. The length of chain dropped into the dust of Redwater Crossing with a final, heavy rattle. The show was over. The crowd, deprived of its prisoner transport, began to break apart, muttering about the strangeness of Cassian Rourke, the waste of good money. Juniper stood alone, adrift in the middle of the street. Her hands, freed, hovered in the air before her, unsure of what to do. The skin of her wrists was raw, red, and already bruising where the iron had bitten. She looked up at Cassian Rourke. He was staring at his horse, a rough-looking bay tied to the rail. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Juniper felt her lungs expand fully. It was a painful, shuddering intake of air. A breath. Just one. Cassian didn't say a word. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't comfort her. He simply shrugged out of his straw-dusted coat. It was a heavy canvas thing, lined with wool and smelling of hay, dry wind, and clean sweat. He pushed it into her hands. It was still warm from his body. "Get on the horse," he said. Juniper looked at the bay, then back at him, confused, her voice a dry croak. "Where?" Cassian was already untying the reins. He didn't look at her as he answered. His words clipped, practical, and final. "We're going to Larkspur Ridge. At least there. You'll get a decent meal." The ride from Redwater Crossing was a silent, vertical climb. Cassian had untied a gray, rough-coated mare tethered behind the feed store. He put Juniper on the bay, the horse she'd seen him with earlier, and he took the mare. He didn't offer her a hand up. He just held the bridle while she awkwardly pulled herself into the worn saddle, her muscles screaming from the tension of the morning. His coat was huge on her, swallowing her small frame, the sleeves hanging 6 inches past her fingertips. It smelled, as she'd noted, of hay and wind, but also of something metallic, like old tools, and the faint, clean scent of lye soap. He led the way, turning the mare's head not toward the wide valley road, but toward a narrow game trail that cut straight up the side of Pine Mesa. The town vanished below them almost immediately, swallowed by the canyons and the dust. With every step the horses took, the air changed. The thick alkali grit of the basin floor gave way to the sharp, medicinal scent of sagebrush crushed under hoof. As they climbed higher, the sage mixed with the clean, resinous tang of pine. The wind up here had teeth. It whipped Juniper's matted hair across her face and whistled through the high rocks. The path was steep, barely wide enough for a single horse, and littered with loose shale that clattered and slid. Cassian rode hunched forward, his body moving with the mare, navigating the switchbacks with an easy, practiced familiarity. Juniper just held onto the saddle horn, her knuckles white. She was exhausted, the adrenaline of the morning draining away, leaving a hollow, shaking cold. She watched the man in front of her. His back was a rigid plank. He never looked back, not once. It took nearly 2 hours. When they finally broke from the trail onto the mesa top, the land flattened out into a vast, wind-scoured plateau. The sky was immense, a pale, unforgiving blue, and in the center of it, looking small against the mountains beyond, was Larkspur Ridge. It was not a ranch, it was the skeleton of one. Cassian Rourke's property was a testament to hardship. The main house was solid, built of thick-cut pine and river stone, but it looked battered, the paint long since scoured off by the wind. The fences were a disaster long, sagging loops of wire held up by leaning posts. The real devastation, however, was the barn, or what was left of it. Juniper stared as they rode past. A full half of the structure was gone, just a collapsed spine of blackened, skeletal timbers. It wasn't a recent fire. The char was old, silvered by sun and scoured by snow. This was the scar Cassian had earned during last year's drought, the one the whole basin had whispered about. He'd lost his herd, they said, lost everything but the land itself. She saw now that the rumors were close to the truth. There were only 4 horses in the corral, and they were thin, their ribs showing faintly through their winter coats. An old dog, gray-muzzled and stiff in the hind legs, rose from the porch. It gave a single, low woof, then seemed to recognize Cassian's mare and sat back down, its tail thumping once against the boards. Cassian dismounted in one fluid motion. He didn't tie the mare, just dropped her reins to the ground. He walked to Juniper's horse and looked up. "This is it," he said, his first words in 2 hours. Juniper slid from the saddle. Her legs buckled, and she pitched forward, catching herself against the bay's warm flank. The ground felt unsteady, rocking beneath her feet. The dog limped over, sniffing at the hem of Cassian's coat that she wore. He was a hound mix, his eyes clouded with age but still intelligent. He nudged his head under her hand, and she instinctively stroked his ears. "That's Tinder," Cassian said, already pulling the saddle from the bay. "He's the welcoming committee." He motioned with his head toward the house. "Go inside. There's a basin on the washstand. Water's in the kettle by the stove. It's probably still warm." Juniper hesitated, clutching the heavy coat around her. What do you want me to do?" Cassian stopped, the heavy saddle balanced on his hip. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his gaze was unsettlingly practical. "First," he said, nodding at her wrists, "you clean those. Infection sets fast up here. There's salt in the jar above the stove. Use it." He turned and hauled the saddle toward the standing half of the barn, leaving her alone on the hard-packed dirt. Juniper went inside. The house was one large room, divided by function. A heavy stove dominated the kitchen area. A long table and 2 chairs sat in the middle, and a cot was shoved against the far wall. It was obsessively neat. The floor was swept. The blankets on the cot were folded at perfect right angles. There was no clutter, no pictures, no sign of any life but the one man. She found the kettle. The water was lukewarm, but it was clean. She poured it into the ceramic basin, found the salt, and shook a heavy pour into the water. She dipped a rag of clean linen into the bowl. When she pressed the stinging cloth to the raw skin of her wrists, her knees went weak. The pain was sharp, a different kind of pain from the biting iron. This was a cleansing pain. She washed away the grime and the dried blood, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the rag. The marks were horrifying. Deep, purpled welts, the skin broken and weeping in 2 places. She finished, drying her hands on a scrap of towel. She stood in the middle of the room, lost. Cassian came in, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards. He didn't look at her, but went to the stove and lifted the lid of a heavy iron pot. A weak plume of steam rose. "It's just beans," he said, stirring them with a wooden spoon, "and cornbread." He pointed with the spoon to a cracked loaf on the counter. It was dark, dense, and looked like it had been cooked 2 days ago. The beans smelled heavily of salt pork, and nothing else. It was the food of a man who had forgotten what pleasure tasted like. But it was warm, and the stove threw off a gentle heat that was slowly penetrating her chilled bones. "There's a room off the back porch," he said, still not looking at her. "It's small, but it's dry. I put some clothes on the cot in there. They'll be too big, but they're clean." He ladled a thick scoop of beans into a tin bowl and pushed it across the table toward her, along with a hunk of the cornbread. Juniper walked to the table and sat down. She looked at the food. It was the first meal offered to her, not thrown at her, in 3 days. She picked up the spoon. As she ate, she studied the room. Her eyes fell on a wooden post near the door. It was covered in small, precise markings, written in white chalk. It was his calendar. It wasn't a calendar of days, but of events. March 10th, wind changed. Came from the north. March 12th, fence down. Section 4, March 14th, calves dropped, 3, 1 lost. April 2nd, wind changed again. Smells like snow. April 5th, Tinder caught a rabbit. It was a logbook of his solitude, a conversation he was having only with himself and the land. He was a man who noticed things, a man who marked the day the wind changed. Juniper stared at the post, the salty beans hot in her mouth. She remembered his gaze in town, how he'd looked at the burn on her dress. He was a man who saw details that didn't fit. She ate everything, scraping the tin bowl clean. Cassian ate his own meal standing by the stove, taking large, efficient bites. The silence was thick, broken only by the scrape of her spoon and the tick-tick-tick of the wind finding a loose shingle on the roof. When he finished, he put his bowl in the wash basin. He pulled on his heavy gloves. "I've got horses to move before the light fails," he said, and walked out. Juniper watched him go. She sat at the table for a long time. She looked at her raw wrists, then at the chalk marks on the post. She felt the warmth of the stove, the solid food in her stomach. She wasn't a prisoner. She was surety. She stood up, took her bowl in his, and walked to the wash basin. She found the lye soap and began to wash. When she was done, she put on his heavy coat and went back outside. The afternoon light was already turning a thin, watery gold. The wind was relentless. Cassian was in the corral, working with one of the thin horses, a stocking-legged gelding. He was moving it in a tight circle, his voice a low, steady rumble she couldn't make out. Juniper looked around. The ranch was desperate for 100 small repairs. A water trough near the barn was leaking. A steady drip, 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 dark a patch of earth. The ground was littered with straw blown from rotted bales. She didn't ask permission. She walked to the standing half of the barn. Inside, it smelled of dry hay and horse. She found a pitchfork. She began to work. She gathered the loose straw, forking it into a clean pile against the good wall. She found a bucket of pine tar and a bundle of rags, and she knelt by the leaking trough. She worked the thick, sticky tar into the seams of the wood, her fingers clumsy in the cold. It was hard, mindless work. It was grounding. With every patch she sealed, she felt the phantom weight of the chains on her wrists lessen. She was doing something real. She worked for over an hour, until the sun was just a red smear on the horizon. She was packing the last seam when Cassian's shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, her hands black with tar. He stood watching her, his face impossible to read in the dusk. He looked at the trough, then at the neat pile of straw. He looked at her, covered in his coat, her face smudged with tar. He hunkered down, his knees cracking. He touched the seam she'd just finished, his gloved finger testing the seal. "You've done this before," he stated. It wasn't a question. "My father had a small holding near the Sweetwater," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. He nodded. He looked at her wrists, which she'd unconsciously hidden in the sleeves of the coat. "Here," he said, his voice quiet. "Everyone carries their own burn marks." He was looking at his own barn when he said it. He was looking at the black timbers, but he was talking to her. Juniper's throat tightened. She just nodded, unable to speak. He stood. "Sun's down. Go inside. The night gets cold fast." That night, she lay on the narrow cot in the small room off the porch. It was little more than a closet, smelling of canvas and old leather, but the door had no lock. She couldn't sleep. The silence of the high mesa was deafening. It was a ringing, empty quiet, filled with the tiny, sharp sounds of the night, the wind under the eaves, the scurry of a mouse in the wall, the endless, high-pitched scree of the night insects, a sound like a rain of tiny needles against the house. Every time she started to drift off, a sound would jerk her awake. The creak of the house settling sounded like a key in a lock. The snap of a cooling timber in the stove sounded like the rattle of a chain. She was terrified. Maddox knew where she was. Hadley knew. They had paid for a fire, and she was the witness who had gotten away. Cassian Rourke was one man, with a broken ranch and an old dog. He was no match for them. She lay there, rigid, staring into the blackness, waiting for the sound of hoofbeats. Then she heard it. A sound from the main house, just outside her door, a chair leg scraping on the floorboards. He was sitting on the porch. She heard the snick of a knife blade opening. Then, a slow, rhythmic sound. Scrape, pause, scrape. He was whittling. The sound was quiet, steady, and utterly mundane. He was sitting on the front porch, in the cold, with his knife, just whittling. He wasn't patrolling. He wasn't holding a rifle. He was just there. Scrape, pause, scrape. It was a signal, a simple, unspoken message. "I am awake. I am here. You are not alone." Juniper closed her eyes. She listened to the sound of the blade on the wood, a steady rhythm against the chaotic symphony of the night. For the first time in 3 days, her muscles began to unclench. She fell asleep to the sound of a man guarding her door with nothing but a pocket knife and his own stubborn presence. She woke before dawn. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The air was frigid. Then she remembered. The ranch, the beans, the sound of the whittling. She got up, her body aching, and dressed in the dark. She put on the clothes Cassian had left a pair of his denim trousers. ridiculously large and held up with a scrap of rope and a thick flannel shirt that smelled of lye. She crept into the main room. It was dark, the embers in the stove just a dull red glow. Cassian was not on the porch. He was asleep on his cot, fully dressed, one arm flung over his face. He hadn't gone to bed until she was asleep. Quiet as a shadow, Juniper went to the stove. She was a capable woman. She knew how to survive. She opened the flue, added 3 small pieces of kindling, and blew gently on the embers. A small flame caught. She added larger pieces of split pine, her movements quick and practiced. Within 5 minutes, she had a low, clean fire burning. She found the coffee grinder, a small metal box, and the sack of green coffee beans. She measured them out, her hands moving with an efficiency that had been beaten into her. She put the coffee in the pot, added water from the bucket, and set it on the stove. As the house began to warm, the old dog, Tinder, uncurled from his mat by the stove. He stretched, his joints popping, and walked over to her. He sniffed her hand, then leaned his entire body against her leg with a heavy, contented sigh. Juniper stroked his head, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in months. The smell of coffee, rich and strong, filled the small cabin. It was that smell that woke Cassian Rourke. He sat up in one abrupt motion, his eyes instantly awake and assessing. He saw her by the stove, with his dog leaning against her, the coffee pot already beginning to steam. She looked like a child playing dress-up in his clothes. But her stance was not that of a child. She was alert, capable, and she had built his fire. He swung his legs off the cot and ran a hand through his rough hair. He didn't say good morning. He didn't thank her for the coffee. He just walked to the stove, grabbed a tin mug, and poured himself a cup. He took a long drink, his eyes closed. He turned and looked at her, the mug steaming in his hand. "We have a deal," he said. It wasn't a question. "I work," Juniper replied, her voice steady. "I earn my keep. You keep the law at bay." That's the shape of it. He agreed. He took another drink. "You're safe from Maddox. As long as you're on this ridge, he won't come up here without a better reason." He looked out the window, at the gray light just beginning to touch the high peaks. "The circuit judge will be in Silver Ledge in 3 weeks, he said, his voice flat. "That's when Pike will set your trial. That's our deadline." Juniper looked at him, her heart thumping a slow, heavy beat. "What deadline?" Cassian finally met her eyes. His were clear, gray, and held no pity, only a cold, hard practicality that she found, to her surprise, she trusted more than any kind word. "The trial date is when they'll sentence you," he said. "But the truth has to come sooner. We've got 3 weeks, Miss Vale, to find out who really lit that fire." The investigation began not with a plan, but with a memory, pulled from Juniper in hesitant fragments 2 nights later. The main room of the ranch house was divided by a sharp line. Lamplight turned the table into a pool of warm yellow, illuminating Cassian's hands and the stub of a pencil he held. The rest of the room, the corners, the ceiling, the space where Juniper sat was deep in shadow. It was a room of stark contrasts, a place where you were either in the light or you were lost in the dark. I was in the tack room," Juniper said, her voice barely a whisper. She was staring into her own hands, twisting a piece of loose thread from the cuff of Cassian's borrowed shirt. "Hadley sent me for a new bridle. He was particular about his bridles. Always wanted them oiled." Cassian didn't speak. He just listened, the pencil hovering over a piece of brown paper he'd smoothed out on the table. "It was late, past 9, maybe. Everyone was gone. Slate, the foreman, had left. Hadley had left. It was just me." She paused, her breathing hitching. "I heard a sound, a thump, like a heavy barrel being dropped on its side. In the main haymow, I thought it was a squatter." She looked up, her eyes finding his in the gloom. I grabbed the lantern, the one they said I dropped. I went to look, but the smell, Cassian, the smell was wrong. Wrong how? His voice was low, pulling the words from her. It wasn't hay, and it wasn't the kerosene from my lamp. It was sharp, thick, like the pine tar we used on the fences at my father's place. But stronger, much stronger. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Cassian's pencil touched the paper. He drew a small square. Tack room. I came around the corner of the stalls, she continued, her voice gaining a thin, reedy strength. And I saw him. He wasn't in the mow. He was by the east door. He was just a shape, a man in a dark coat and a brown, wide-brimmed hat. He was running. He ran out the door, toward the creek. He never even saw me. And the fire. It wasn't a lantern fire. It wasn't a spill. The whole north wall of the haymow just went up. Like a torch, a whoosh, so loud. In the heat it pushed me back. I dropped the lantern then. I dropped it running away. She was shaking now, the memory too close. I ran out the front. I was screaming. Fire! That's when Maddox grabbed me. He came out of nowhere. Cassian, like he was waiting. He grabbed me and said, "Got you, you little firebug." And I never got to say anything else. Cassian was silent for a long minute. He looked at the marks on the paper. He sketched a long rectangle. Haymow. He drew an arrow by the side. Wind, N.W. Where did Hadley keep his oil barrels? He asked. Outside, by the west wall, with the kerosene and the axle grease. Cassian drew a small circle. Kerosene. Then he looked at her. Pine tar. No, she said, confused. Hadley never used tar. He bought his posts pre-treated from the rail depot. He said tarring was dirty work. He hated dirty work. Cassian circled the spot where she'd seen the man. East door, brown hat. He added an arrow pointing away, toward creek. He pushed the paper to the center of the table. It was a crude map, but it was a map of contradictions. The fire started in the haymow, but the supposed accelerant, the kerosene, was on the opposite side of the yard. The wind was from the northwest, which would have blown a lantern fire away from the main structure, not into it. And a man was running toward the creek, reeking of pine tar that shouldn't have been there. Tomorrow, Cassian said, his voice flat. We check the creek. They rode out just after dawn, leaving Tinder to guard the quiet ranch. They didn't take the main road. Cassian led them on a high ridge path that overlooked the Hadley stockyards from a distance of 2 miles. The place was a ruin, a sprawling black stain on the valley floor. He took them down into the cottonwoods that lined Kestrel Creek, a mile downstream from the burned-out ranch. The place was a tangle of wild blackberry and downed trees, tucked into a fold in the bank, almost completely overgrown. Was Miller's old sluice. It was a relic from a small, failed gold rush 10 years prior. Just a rotting wooden chute and a collapsed rocker box. Why here? Juniper asked, sliding from the mare. Because, Cassian said, scanning the ground. It's the only place on this creek you can get a wagon to, that you can't see from the main road. He walked the perimeter, his eyes missing nothing. The ground was too trampled by cattle to hold a clear boot print. But he wasn't looking for prints. He was looking for what didn't belong. He found it behind the collapsed rocker. It was a clearing, hidden by a curtain of wild rye. In the center sat 2 large, empty wooden barrels. They were new, the metal hoop still bright. Cassian knelt. He ran a gloved finger along the inside rim of one. He held it up to Juniper. His glove was coated in a thick, sticky, black gold residue. The air around the barrels hung with the sharp, acidic tang of fresh pine tar. This isn't Hadley's, Juniper whispered, her hand going to her mouth. No, Cassian said. He pointed to the stenciling on the side. KRD, Kestrel Rail Depot. This is railroad stock, meant for sealing ties, or for making a barn go up like a torch. Juniper finished, her voice cold. She looked at Cassian, a new memory surfacing, sharp and clear. The train, I remember now. Just before I heard the barrel thump, I heard the train whistle from Kestrel Depot. The 9:30 cargo train. I remember thinking it was running late. Cassian's eyes narrowed. The 9:30, that's the weekly freight from Silver Ledge. He stood, wiping the tar from his glove onto the dry grass. A man could pick up a shipment at 9:30, have it loaded, and be at Hadley's back gate by 10, light the fire, and be gone by 10:15. They rode back in silence, the weight of the two barrels sitting heavy in the air between them. They had a how. They just didn't have a who or a why. The why began to take shape 2 days later. They needed supplies, and Cassian's credit, while thin, was still good at the mercantile. He went in for flour and beans. Juniper, wearing his coat with the collar high, went to find May Albright. She found her in the alley behind the boarding house, shaking out rugs. May's face went pale when she saw Juniper. "Child, you shouldn't be here. The sheriff—"
"May, please,"
Juniper said, her voice low and urgent.
"The fire, I didn't do it, but they're Cassian, we're trying to prove it."
May looked over her shoulder, her hands twisting in her apron.
"I don't know anything. Juniper, I just—"
"Hadley. Did he say anything before the fire? Was he worried in debt?" Mister.
"Hadley."
May seemed shocked.
"Heavens, no, he was flush, bragging, even just bought a new buggy, paid in cash."
May stopped, her eyes widening. "Wait, that's right. The day before the fire. He was in the mercantile when I was buying linens." She looked around again, then reached into her apron pocket. Her hand came out with a small, folded piece of paper. It was a receipt copy, thin and yellow.
"I saw him buy it,"
May whispered, pressing the paper into Juniper's hand. "I thought it was odd. I asked Mr. Henderson why a man who hated tar was buying so much of it. Henderson just said Mr. Hadley's business was his own." Juniper's fingers, numb, unfolded the paper. It was a receipt from the Kestrel Rail Depot, countersigned by the mercantile. 1 order, 2 barrels, pine tar. The signature at the bottom, a flamboyant, arrogant scrawl, was clear Eustace Hadley. The date was 1 day before the fire. "He bought it himself," Juniper breathed.
"Juniper, you get out of here,"
May hissed, pushing her toward the street. "You don't have this from me. You understand, he and Judge Pike are thick as thieves. You be careful." Juniper tucked the receipt inside her shirt. It felt as heavy as a bar of lead. As she rounded the corner to meet Cassian, a man stepped from the shadow of the assay office. It was Deputy Lyle Bracken, a young, nervous man who always seemed to be apologizing for his badge. "Miss Vale," he said, tipping his hat. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Deputy."
"I just wanted to say, you be careful, that's all."
"Careful of what, Mr. Bracken?" He licked his lips, his gaze darting to the sheriff's office down the street. Some people think they own this town. Lock, stock, and barrel. And Judge Pike, he's the one holds the keys. He shuffled his feet. Larkspur Ridge is a long way out. It's easy to get lost up there. You tell Mr. Rourke that. It was a warning, delivered as a kindness, which made it all the more terrifying. He touched his hat again and was gone. Cassian was across the street, his face grim. He was questioning Gideon Pike, the blacksmith, Judge Pike's estranged nephew. Gideon was a mountain of a man, with arms like tree limbs, but he looked small, hunched over his anvil as Cassian spoke. As Juniper approached, she heard Gideon's low rumble.
"It's just Cassian. He's my uncle. Blood."
"Blood don't make a thing right, Gideon," Cassian said. "I'm not asking you to testify. I'm asking what you saw." Gideon wiped his face with a sooty hand. "I saw wagon tracks. That night, near the east gate, same as you asked. And I found this." He opened his fist. On his broad, calloused palm lay a single, oddly shaped horseshoe nail. It's a cold-forged nail, custom, for a heavy-gated show horse. Ain't but one man in this county who special orders nails like that, 'cause his prize mare throws shoes. Hadley, Cassian said.
I ain't saying that,
Gideon said, his voice pleading.
I'm just saying that's the nail. Now get out of here, Cassian, before someone sees us.
That night, the pieces were on the table. The lamp was lit again, but this time, the shadows felt deeper, more threatening. There was Cassian's map. There was the tar receipt, signed by Hadley. There was the verbal report of Hadley's custom nail, found where the man in the brown hat had run. Juniper had one more piece. She had spent the afternoon studying the warrant Orville Pike had signed. The original had been given to Cassian as part of the surety bond.
Look,
she said, sliding the paper into the light.
Look at the seal.
Cassian leaned in. The embossed stamp of the county judiciary was pressed into the paper at the bottom right, but it was crooked. The bottom third of the seal, the part that read Dry Arrow County, was missing entirely, as if pressed in a hurry, against an uneven surface.
And the signature,
Juniper said, her finger tracing the ink.
It's shaky. He didn't even finish his last name. It's just Orville P. This wasn't signed in his office. Cassian, this looks like it was signed on a saddlebag. Or in the street.
Signed after Maddox had you, Cassian said, the realization dawning. He arrested you, then he went and got the warrant. The implications hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Hadley bought the tar. Hadley, or someone he paid, set the fire, using his own special horse for the transport. Judge Pike, his partner, had a warrant ready to go, and Sheriff Maddox was waiting in the street to arrest the scapegoat.
But why?
Juniper asked, her mind racing.
May said he was flush. Why burn his own barn?
Land, Cassian said, his voice a low growl.
He didn't lose 50 head of cattle. Juniper, he'd moved them. I saw the tracks.
He moved his prime stock up to the high pasture 2 days before the fire. He burned the barn, and the scrub cattle, the ones he couldn't sell.
Insurance,
Juniper whispered.
He'd just bought that new policy from the Denver office. He was bragging about it. He burned his old barn to get a new one, and get paid for cattle he was going to cull anyway.
And you, Cassian said, his eyes hard as flint, were the tinder, the girl with no family, no money, the perfect person to take the blame. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a conspiracy clicking into place. It was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. A rock, the size of a man's fist, crashed through the front window, spraying the room with cold night air and slivers of glass. It landed on the floor and rolled, stopping at Cassian's feet. Juniper screamed, jumping back into the shadows. Tinder erupted in a frenzy of barking, scratching at the door. Cassian didn't flinch. He just looked at the rock. He bent, picked it up, and unwound the dirty piece of paper tied to it with twine. He held it up to the lamplight. The words were scrawled in charcoal. "Give the girl back. Last warning." Juniper was shaking, her back pressed to the wall.
"They're coming! Oh, God, Cassian, they're coming for me!"
Cassian looked at the note, then at the shattered window. His face was a mask of cold fury. He crumpled the paper in his fist. He didn't run for his rifle. He didn't pace. He walked to the corner, picked up his toolbox, and pulled out a hammer, some nails, and a spare piece of board he'd been saving to patch the porch. He went to the window and began, in the dim light, to methodically nail the board over the broken pane. Thwack! 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 The sound was steady, measured. It was the sound of a man who would not be moved. Juniper watched him. His calm was more potent than any panicked defense. The shaking in her hands began to slow. He wasn't just fixing a window. He was reinforcing his claim. She walked to the wall where his carbine, a Winchester repeater, rested on 2 wooden pegs. She took it down. The metal was cold and heavy. Cassian stopped hammering. He looked at her, holding the rifle.
Tomorrow,
she said, her voice low, but for the first time, completely steady. You teach me how to use this properly. Cassian nodded once. He turned back to the window and drove the last nail home. The night was sealed out. He walked to the table and blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. They stood there for a moment, the only light coming from the red glow of the stove's embers. They're sloppy, Cassian said, his voice coming from the dark. Hadley signing his own receipt, Pike rushing the warrant, and this, he tossed the crumpled note toward the stove.
This is desperation.
He turned, a tall shadow against the faint red light. We're not just clearing you, Juniper. We're exposing them. The rumor reached them not on the wind, but from the mouth of the only man in Redwater Crossing who looked more afraid than angry. Cassian had ridden down to the smithy on the pretense of resetting the mare's shoe. Gideon Pike was shaping a glowing piece of iron, the clang hiss of his work echoing off the stone walls. Deputy Lyle Bracken was there, waiting in the shadows, his hat in his hands. He's planning it. Rourke. Bracken stammered, his eyes darting to the street. Hadley's been in his ear all morning. Burke's convinced you're harboring a fugitive instead of holding surety. He says the bond's invalid if Miss Vale ain't properly contained. Contained? Cassian's voice was dangerously low. He means locked up. Gideon Pike growled, not looking up from the anvil. He's coming up tonight. Cassian. A surprise inspection. He aims to find a reason, any reason, to revoke your bond and take her back. And this time, he'll take her straight to the state quarry train. No stops. He'll have Pike's signature on it, legal or not, Bracken added, misery in his voice. Watch yourself. He's bringing men. Cassian didn't reply. He just paid Gideon for the shoeing, his face carved from the same stone as the mesa, and rode the long way home, ascending the switchbacks as the sun began to bleed into the west. When he entered the cabin, Juniper was at the table, cleaning the Winchester with a small, oiled rag. She had learned the weapon's mechanism in 2 days, her hands moving with a new, grim purpose. She looked up, sensing the change in him. He's coming, Cassian said, no preamble. Tonight. Juniper's hand stopped. The rag went still. Maddox? He's coming to find an excuse to take you. For a moment, she just stared at the rifle parts on the table. Then, she stood up. She went to the small shelf where she'd hidden the folded warrant, the tar receipt, and Cassian's crude map. The corn, she said. Cassian nodded. He dragged the heavy bin of dry feed corn away from the wall. It was 3/4 full. He found a small tin box meant for coffee, and Juniper carefully folded their evidence inside it. She pressed the lid down tight. If they find it, they won't, Cassian said. He plunged his arm deep into the dry corn, the kernels rattling like dead seeds, and buried the box at the very bottom. He shoved the heavy bin back against the wall. It looked untouched. The sun was down now, and the cabin was sinking into twilight. Cassian didn't light the main lamp. He went outside. Juniper watched him through the open door. He moved with a dark, agricultural purpose. He wasn't building a barricade. He was setting a trap. He took a spool of thin baling wire and strung it, ankle high, between the corner of the porch and the weak point in the corral fence, the main approach. From the wire, he hung 3 small, brass mule bells. They were tiny, but in the profound silence of the high mesa, they would sound like a fire alarm. He came back inside and bolted the door. He lit the small storm lantern, the one with the thick glass and the focused beam, but left the main lamp dark. Eat, he said, pushing a hunk of yesterday's bread toward her. They waited. The hours passed. The moon rose. It was nearly full. A cold, silver dollar punched into the black sky. It bathed the hard-packed yard in a stark, theatrical light, painting the world in shades of silver and impenetrable black. Tinder, The old hound lay by the hearth, his head on his paws, but his breathing was unsettled. It was just past 11 when the dog's head came up. A low, soft woof vibrated in his chest. Juniper, who had been sitting rigid on her cot, stopped breathing. Cassian was already on his feet, moving to the boarded-up window. He peered through a crack in the wood. Then, from the darkness, came the sound, a faint, metallic jingle-jangle-jingle. The bell. Tinder erupted. A deep, furious, rattling bark filled the small cabin. In one smooth motion, Cassian crossed the room and blew out the storm lantern. The cabin was plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the 2 silver rectangles of the windows. "Get away from the door," Cassian whispered. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a pressurized boiler. He was already by the door, his hand on the bolt. Outside, a man cursed. "Damn dog, Slate. You and Jed checked the barn. He's probably got her tied in there." "The hell with the barn." A second, rougher voice Slate snarled. "Hadley said get the girl. She's in the house. Burke's meeting us at the pass on the way back." Footsteps on the porch. Heavy, 3 men. A heavy fist pounded the door. Boom, boom, boom. "Rourke, open this door. We're here on county business. We're here to inspect the premises." Cassian didn't move. Juniper was pressed against the far wall, by the stove, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would break her ribs. Boom! The door shuddered in its frame. "To hell with this!" Slate yelled. A heavy weight slammed against the door. A boot. They were trying to kick it in. The old wood held, but the latch bar groaned. "Juniper!" Cassian's voice was sharp. A command. "The hearth, the oil can. Now!" She understood. By the hearth was a small can of kerosene for the lamps. She grabbed it. "When I open this," Cassian said, his hand on the heavy bolt, "throw it on the porch floor, on the wood. Aim for their feet." "They'll..." "Just do it." The door slammed again, the frame splintering. "Now," Cassian said. He ripped the bolt back. The door flew open, torn from his grip by the force of the next kick. A man, a heavy shape silhouetted against the brilliant moonlight, stumbled in, expecting to meet resistance. Instead, he met open air. "What the..." "Now, Juniper." From the darkness, Juniper flung the contents of the can. A quart of lamp oil arced through the air and hit the porch floor, splashing across the boots of the 2 men still outside. The man who had stumbled in Jed was regaining his balance, raising a pistol. Cassian didn't give him the chance. He wasn't armed with a gun. He was armed with light. He had the storm lantern in his left hand, the flint striker in his right. He'd been waiting. Tick-tick spark. The lantern wick caught. A brilliant, white-hot cone of light exploded into the small room, aimed directly at the intruders' faces. It was like a physical blow. The 3 men, their eyes adjusted to the silver moonlight, were instantly, totally blinded. They cried out, throwing their arms up. "Can't see, get the light." The man inside, Jed, fired his pistol, but the shot was wild, panicked, shattering the water basin against the far wall. The 2 on the porch scrambled back, but their boots found the oil-slicked wood. The one on the right, the 3rd man, went down like a felled tree, his feet sliding out from under him. He hit the porch boards with a crack and a grunt of pain. The man who was still standing Slate pawed at his eyes. Turning to run, he hit the slick patch and pinwheeled, grabbing the porch rail, just barely keeping his feet. Cassian was already moving. He moved through the blinding light, a shadow within the glare. He hit the armed man, Jed with his shoulder, a solid block of mesa granite. The man went down, his head striking the floor. It was over in 5 seconds. Juniper was already outside, the coil of rope she'd been holding passing for the reins in her hand. She was on the man who had fallen, the 3rd man, looping the rope around his wrists before he could clear his vision. Cassian burst onto the porch, grabbed Slate, and slammed him against the cabin wall.
My eyes, I can't see, Slate whimpered,
the fight gone out of him. You can't see, Cassian growled, his voice a rasp. You can't walk, and you're on my land. The third man, trussed by Juniper, was groaning. Jed was unconscious on the cabin floor. Cassian hauled Slate into the moonlight, away from the slick. The foreman's vision was returning, watery and pained. He looked at Cassian, then at Juniper, who was standing there, rope in hand, his coat hanging off her, breathing hard. The man's face was revealed in the moonlight. It was, as they'd guessed, Eustace Hadley's foreman, a weasel-faced man named Slate. We was just, Slate stammered, his bravado gone, replaced by a whining fear. We was just coming to get her, legal-like, sheriff's orders. He deputized us. We was coming to claim her, by law. There is no law that lets you break down a man's door in the middle of the night, Cassian said. He picked up the pistol the first man had dropped and tucked it into his belt. Juniper finished tying the third man's hands. She recognized him, a drifter who worked for Hadley. Cassian pressed Slate against the wall. You came for the girl, or did Hadley send you to silence her? Which is it? No. Slate was terrified. Just to grab her, Burke was gonna say she tried to escape. He was gonna void the bond. Hadley just wants this mess cleaned up before the insurance draft comes. The insurance draft, Cassian said, his voice flat. He looked at Juniper. It's coming on the wagon tomorrow night, Slate blurted, desperate to trade information for his life. Hadley's sending all his claim papers, the affidavits, the insurance bonds, all of it to the agent in Silver Ledge. It's in his strongbox. He wants it out of the county, safe, before anything else happens. A wagon, Cassian repeated. Tomorrow night, where?
The switchback cut, Slate whimpered. It's the only way. He's sending 2 guards. It's leaving after dark.
Cassian held him there for a long, silent moment. The moon was so bright it bleached the color from Slate's face, leaving it a mask of pure terror. Juniper, Cassian said. Cut them loose.
What?
She said, stunned.
Cut them loose.
She hesitated, then found her knife and cut the ropes on the third man. Cassian shoved Slate toward the steps. Get him, he said, nodding to the unconscious man on the floor. Slate and the other man, terrified and confused, scrambled to obey. They hoisted their partner, Jed, between them. You go back to Hadley, Cassian said, his voice deadly quiet. He stood on his porch, a dark, immovable shape. You tell him his men are clumsy. You tell him this is my land, and she is my surety. You tell him if he sends anyone else up here, I'll drop them in a mine shaft. The 2 men stumbled, dragging the third, and ran for their horses, which were tethered in the trees. They mounted and fled, disappearing into the darkness. Juniper stood on the porch, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the rail. The smell of kerosene was thick in the air.
They'll be back,
she whispered, her voice trembling.
They'll come back?
Yes, Cassian said. He was already getting the board and hammer to fix the door latch. He was right. They came back, but it wasn't Slate. It was dawn. The sun was just hitting the ridge, and the air was cold and clean. Juniper was sweeping up the broken ceramic from the water basin when Tinder started his low, warning growl. This time the hoofbeats were slow, official. Cassian stepped onto the porch. Juniper stood in the shadows just behind him. Sheriff Burke Maddox rode into the yard. He was alone, but he sat his horse like he had an army at his back. He looked at the splintered door, the slick of oil on the porch, and his lips curled into a sneer. Morning, Rourke, he boomed. Looks like you had a rough night. Problem with the local wildlife. Just some of Hadley's strays. Cassian said, They got lost. Burke's eyes hardened. I'm here for an official inspection. I have reason to believe the prisoner, Juniper Vale is not being properly secured. I'm here to assess the terms of your bond. Now stand aside." "No," Cassian said. Burke's hand dropped to the butt of his pistol. "What did you say?" I said no. "You're not setting foot in my house." Cassian held up the folded surety bond. "This paper says I'm responsible for her. It says I will produce her for trial. It says nothing about inspections. It says nothing about you assessing my home. She's here. I'm here. That's the bond." "I have a warrant, Rourke," Maddox snarled, pulling a paper from his coat. "Signed by Judge Pike himself, ordering a search and seizure. Now stand aside." He swung down from his horse, the paper in his hand. Cassian didn't move from the doorway. "Let me see it." Maddox, arrogant, shoved the paper at him. Cassian took it. He didn't read the words. He looked at the bottom, just as Juniper had. "This isn't a warrant," Cassian said. "The hell it ain't. Pike signed it." "He did," Cassian agreed. "But he forgot to seal it properly. The county stamp, it's half missing. Looks like it was done in a hurry." He held it up. "An unsealed warrant ain't worth the paper it's printed on. It's not a legal document. It's just a threat." Burke Maddox stared. He knew Cassian was right. The hurried backroom deal with Pike, the sloppy signature on the saddlebag, it was all coming back on him. He had no legal standing. Not here, not against a landowner who knew his rights. "You're making a mistake, Rourke," Burke hissed, his face a dark, mottled red. "You're obstructing—" "I'm protecting my property. You come back here with a valid, sealed, legal warrant, sheriff, and we can talk. Until then, get off my land." Maddox snatched the paper back. He stood there, vibrating with a rage he couldn't unleash. He was trapped. He looked past Cassian into the darkness of the cabin and saw Juniper's pale face watching him. His eyes promised terrible things. "This ain't over," he spat. "You'll be at that trial, and she'll be on the train. Count on it." He mounted his horse, yanked the reins so hard the bit tore at the animal's mouth, and galloped out of the yard. The sound of the hoofbeats faded. Juniper stepped out onto the porch. The adrenaline of the long night drained away, leaving her weak. The broken door, the smell of oil, the sheriff's threat, it was too much. She began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that started in her knees and consumed her. She leaned against the porch post, her forehead pressed to the cold wood. She was going to be sick. She didn't hear Cassian move. She only felt it. A sudden, surprising warmth. He stepped up behind her. He didn't wrap his arms around her. He didn't speak. He just placed one large, calloused hand on the nape of her neck. His hand was solid. It was heavy. It was incredibly warm. It wasn't a caress. It was an anchor. It was a physical, unspoken statement. He held it there, his thumb pressing gently against the bone, steadying her. The trembling didn't stop, but it centered. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of lye soap, clean pine, and the faint metallic tang of the rifle oil. "It's still your home, Juniper," he said, his voice so low it was almost a rumble she felt through his hand. "He doesn't get to take that." She nodded, her forehead still against the post. They stood like that for a long minute. Then he let his hand drop. The spell was broken. He stepped back, and his voice was practical again. "Slate was stupid. He told the truth." Juniper turned, pulling the tattered edges of her courage back around her. "The strongbox, tomorrow night. He'll have it guarded." Cassian said, "He won't just be protecting the papers. He'll be protecting his alibi." "We can't let it get to Silver Ledge," she said. "If those papers are filed, the insurance is paid, and I'm the only thing left to clean up." Cassian looked out at the mesa, his eyes fixed on the distant notch in the rocks that was the switchback cut. "No," he said. "It doesn't get to Silver Ledge." He went to the barn. She followed. He began checking his tack. He pulled out a spool of heavy-gauge steel wire. He found a set of iron pry bars. Juniper went to the horses. The bay was steady. The mare was strong, but in the back stall was a third horse she'd been gentling, a pale, gray-white filly with a nervous energy and a lightness in her step, a horse built for speed and shadow.
"I'll take Winterglass,"
Juniper said. Cassian looked at the horse, then at her. He nodded. He went to his saddle trunk and pulled out 2 long, dark canvas dusters. He threw one to her. "Tomorrow night," Cassian said, "we stop a wagon." The switchback cut was a scar on the face of the mesa, a narrow wagon path carved between 2 sheer walls of sandstone. It was the only route to the high pass, and it was barely wide enough for a single axle. In the brittle, silver light of the moon, it was a perfect trap. Wind hissed through the sagebrush, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and dust. It was the only sound. "Here," Cassian said. His voice was a low rumble, swallowed by the rocks. He uncoiled the heavy-gauge steel wire. He didn't string it to trip. He strung it to stop. He wrapped one end around a thick, gnarled piñon root, twisting it, anchoring it with the mechanical certainty of a man who'd spent his life mending fences. The other end he took across the path, to a narrow gap between 2 boulders. "Pull," he ordered. Juniper, her hands raw in her thin gloves, braced her feet and hauled the wire taut. It vibrated in the cold. A single, deadly guitar string stretched chest-high to a horse. Cassian hammered a steel pin into a crack in the rock, looped the wire, and hammered the pin deep, locking it in place. The wire was almost invisible, a thin black line against the dark shadows. He and Juniper then spent 10 minutes weaving clumps of dry sagebrush into the wire, breaking the line, making it look like just another tangle of overgrown brush. They moved to their positions. Juniper led Winterglass back into a deep cleft in the rock. 100 feet down the path, the mare's pale gray coat was a ghost in the shadows. Juniper stayed in the saddle, the Winchester carbine resting across her thighs. Cassian took his place on a high ledge, just above the wire. He lay flat on the cold stone, the pry bar and a heavy chisel next to him. He was just another shadow, part of the rock. Then there was only the wind. They waited. The moon climbed, making the shadows shorter, sharper. Juniper's legs ached with cold, and her breath plumed in front of her face. She focused on the sound of Winterglass's soft, steady breathing, matching her own to it. An hour passed, then another. Just when the cold had seeped so deep she thought her nerves were dead, she heard it. It wasn't loud. It was the faint, rhythmic jingle clink of harness and the low, grating rumble of iron-bound wheels on stone. A voice, rough and bored, drifted up the cut. "Last run. Thank the Lord. My backside's about froze. Soon as we hand this box to the agent in Silver Ledge, I'm finding a bottle." The wagon appeared. It was a heavy-duty freight wagon. Its canvas cover strapped down tight, drawn by a team of 4. One man was driving. Another sat beside him, a shotgun resting across his lap. They were moving at a steady walk, the horses blowing steam. The lead pair reached the sagebrush. Their chests hit the steel wire. It was not a gentle stop. The wire sang, a high-pitched twang, and held. The lead horses screamed, a high, terrifying sound, and reared. Throwing their full weight back, the driver, caught completely by surprise, was yanked forward, his curses lost in the panic. "Whoa, whoa, damn you!" The wagon, its momentum stopped dead, shuddered. The 2 rear horses, confused, pushed forward, jackknifing the wagon. It happened exactly as Cassian had planned. The wire was angled just so. The sudden, violent stop, combined with the push from the rear, forced the wagon's left front wheel off the narrow, hard-packed track. There was a sound of crack thud. The wheel dropped into the deep, dry rain gulch that lined the cut. The wagon lurched, the axle snapping, and pitched onto its side at a 45-degree angle. The two guards were thrown from the driver's box like dolls, crashing onto the rocky ground. The shotgun skittered away into the darkness. "We're hit ambush," the driver yelled, scrambling to his feet, pulling a pistol. But Juniper was already moving. Winterglass exploded from the shadows. The mare, trained for quick starts, covered the 100 feet in a blur of pale gray. Juniper didn't ride at the men. She rode at the wagon. She had the grappling hook, a small, four-pronged anchor tied to a lariat, in her hand. As she galloped past the tilted wagon, she threw it. It clanged, a loud, metallic sound, against the wagon bed. The hooks caught the heavy iron handle of the strongbox, the very one Slate had described. Juniper didn't stop. She veered Winterglass back into the rocks, the lariat snapping taut. The strongbox, weighing a good 80 pounds, was ripped from its strapping and dragged, scraping and bouncing, from the wagon. It crashed to the ground 10 yards away. "What in the— It's the girl," the shotgun guard yelled, finding his feet. He saw Juniper wheeling the horse in the moonlight. He never saw Cassian. Cassian had dropped from his ledge the second the wagon tilted. He was at the strongbox. He wasn't trying to pick the lock. He had the chisel and a small sledgehammer. Clang! The sound was as loud as a gunshot, echoing off the canyon walls. The driver fired his pistol, but the shot was wild, the bullet screaming off into the night. Clang, clang! Cassian set the chisel at the hasp, right where the cheap iron lock was riveted to the wood. He was a man who knew how to break things. He found the seam. He dropped the hammer and slammed the pry bar into the crack. Crack! The sound of splintering oak was sickening. With one massive, groaning heave, he put his entire weight on the bar. The lid of the strongbox popped open. "Get her, get the girl!" the driver was yelling, fumbling to reload. But Cassian's hand was already inside. He didn't grab the whole box. He grabbed the oilcloth-wrapped packet of papers tucked on top. He shoved the entire bundle inside his long, dark duster. "Drop it, Rourke, drop it or she's dead." The voice was high on the ridge above them. It was a voice they knew. Sheriff Burke Maddox. A muzzle flashed from the rocks. 100 yards up. Whang crack! The bullet screamed off the strongbox, not 2 inches from Cassian's head, spraying his face with metal fragments. Juniper looked up. 4 men, silhouetted against the moon. Maddox, and 3 others, Slate. The information had been a trap, a double cross. They hadn't been sent to grab her. They'd been sent to die, and to draw Cassian and Juniper out. "The creek!" Cassian roared. He didn't run for the horses. The horses were open targets. He grabbed Juniper's arm, pulling her off Winterglass, and yanked her toward the blackest shadow, the steep, gravel-filled arroyo that was the dry bed of Kestrel Creek. They slid, half falling, down the 8-foot bank. Pizzu. A bullet kicked up a spray of dust by Juniper's feet. She stumbled, a cry of terror torn from her. "Move!" Cassian bellowed, pulling her up. They plunged into the darkness of the creek bed. "They're in the wash," Maddox yelled from above. "Spread out, flush them." They reached a bend in the creek, the rock wall momentarily shielding them from the men on the ridge. They were scrambling, sliding, trying to get down to their level. Juniper stopped. She was shaking, but her hands were steady. She ripped the carbine from her shoulder. "Get back," she said. She planted her feet. She wasn't aiming at the men. She aimed at the sheer rock face above them. She pulled the trigger. Crack! The sound was deafening, multiplied by the canyon. The bullet hit the sandstone, ricocheted with a high, terrifying whee, and sparked. The men on the ridge froze, ducking for cover. Crack! Crack! She fired twice more, not at them, but near them. The echoes and the flying stone chips were enough. Their pursuit stopped. "The wind," Cassian said, his voice urgent. He had a small leather pouch in his hand. The wind was gusting up the canyon, from their backs, toward the ridge. "Cover your face!" he yelled. He pulled the drawstring, and with a powerful underhand throw, he flung the entire contents of the pouch up into the air. It wasn't gunpowder. It was charcoal dust, ground as fine as flour, from his own forge. The cloud of black powder hung in the air for a single second, and then the wind caught it. It didn't explode. It expanded. An instantaneous, choking cloud of impenetrable blackness surged up the canyon wall, completely blotting out the moon, the ridge, and the men. Yells of "Can't see what is it" came from the cloud. "Run," Cassian said. They ran. They plunged down the creek bed, their boots sinking into patches of freezing, ankle-deep mud. The water was icy, soaking them to the shins, but they didn't feel it. They ran, shadows in the blackness, for 2 miles, until their lungs were fire and their legs were lead. They didn't stop until they staggered into the yard of Larkspur Ridge, just as the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky. The cabin was a sanctuary. Cassian bolted the door, his hands shaking so violently from cold and adrenaline he could barely work the latch. Juniper collapsed onto the stool by the stove. The cold hit her all at once. Her teeth began to chatter, a loud, rattling sound in the quiet room. Cassian didn't comfort her. He moved with a grim, practical urgency. "Get those wet clothes off, now!" His voice was rough. He threw the heavy wool blanket from his cot at her, followed by his old, dry canvas coat. He turned his back, giving her the illusion of privacy as he fought with the kindling. Juniper's fingers were numb, but she tore at the wet, muddy clothes, her body shaking in violent waves. She wrapped herself in the blanket, then the coat, and huddled over the stove. Cassian got the fire going. The whoosh of the kindling catching was the best sound she had ever heard. Soon, the iron stove was ticking, throwing off a wave of life-giving heat. He boiled water, but he didn't make coffee. He took a bundle of dried sage leaves from a nail on the wall and crushed them into a tin pot, pouring the boiling water over them. The sharp, clean, medicinal smell cut through the stench of creek mud and fear. He handed her a steaming tin mug. "Drink." She did. The tea was bitter, but it was hot. It burned a path down to her stomach, and the chattering of her teeth began to slow. Cassian sat at the table. He laid the oilcloth-wrapped packet in the pool of light from the single lamp. His fingers, still blue with cold, fumbled with the wet string. He unrolled it. The papers were damp, but the ink was clear. He laid them out. First, the insurance contract from the Denver office. The policy was valued at $5,000. It was a fortune, enough to build a mansion, not just replace a barn. Second, a hand-drawn map of the Hadley stockyards. It was Hadley's flamboyant, arrogant handwriting. The main barn was circled. In the margin, 2 notes: move prime stock to high pasture, 2s, and clear section B, weds. The fire, she remembered, had been set on a Thursday. It was a burn order. Last, there was a letter. It was on Judge Orville Pike's official judiciary stationery. Cassian picked it up. His voice, flat and hard, cut through the sound of the wind rattling the new board on the window. "Eustace," he read. "The matter is handled. The girl is in custody, and the bond is high enough no one will take it. I have the papers ready for the quarry transport. But you must be quick. The insurance assessors from Denver are skeptical. The payment must be secured before they arrive." He paused, his eyes scanning the last lines. "Get the strongbox to Silver Ledge. Once the draft is paid, I will see to it the trial is dismissed. A formality. The girl will be gone, and we will be square. Oh, Pike." The room was silent. Juniper stared at the paper, the tin mug frozen halfway to her lips. "Dismissed," she whispered. He wasn't going to have a trial. He was going to dismiss it after I was gone." "Gone," Cassian repeated, the word like a chip of ice. "On a transport train, lost in transit, a failed escape. You were never meant to make it to the quarry, Juniper." The full, cold weight of it hit her. We have to get this to Silver Ledge. To the U.S. Marshal. No. Cassian stood up, his chair scraping on the floor. We don't. Slate was a trap. Maddox was waiting. This letter implicates Pike. Pike is the law here. Maddox is his gun. Who do we give it to, Bracken? He's too scared to tie his own boots. We give this to one man. We're dead before sundown. And this paper is ash. He paced, a caged wolf in the small cabin. The entire system. It's rotten. From the top, all the way down. Then what? Her voice was a bare whisper.
What do we do?
Cassian stopped. He looked at the chalk-marked post by the door. His eyes scanned his lonely calendar. They stopped on the last mark. April 14th. Sunday. We don't give it to one man, he said. A new, hard edge was in his voice. We give it to all of them. The town, Sunday morning, at the Wheat Chapel. He looked at her, his gray eyes catching the lamplight. It's the one place everyone in this basin gathers, every single week. It's the one place Hadley and Pike have to be, to show their pious faces. It's a public meeting, and it's on neutral ground. He picked up the letter, his hand steady now. Pastor Abel Whitlow is an honest man, and he's the keeper of the county register. He signs the births, the marriages, and the deaths. He's the only other official record in this town. He looked at Juniper, and for the first time, it wasn't just anger or calculation in his face. It was something else, a spark. We don't just show them the evidence. Juniper, we make them sign their names to it. We make the entire town a witness. We don't go to the law. We make the law. It was Saturday, the day of waiting. Tomorrow, they would walk into the Wheat Chapel and face the town. They would either save themselves or be torn apart. The cabin on Larkspur Ridge, which had become a fortress, now felt like a holding cell. The air was thin and tight, vibrating with the things they had not said. The evidence, the letter, the map, the insurance policy was wrapped in its oilcloth on the table, a sleeping viper. Cassian was sitting at that table, his left arm extended, palm up. The light of the late afternoon was thick, streaming in through the one good window, illuminating the air, making the million tiny particles of straw, dust, and wood smoke hang suspended, like gold flecks in quartz. He had not mentioned it, but Juniper had seen him favoring the hand all day. A long, shallow graze, dark and angry, ran from his wrist to his elbow. It was from the ambush, a spray of metal fragments or pulverized rock from Maddox's shot against the strongbox. He had washed it with lye soap, but it needed tending. Juniper brought the basin of warm water, the salt, and the last of the clean linen rags. She sat opposite him, not on her stool, but on the bench, close enough that her knee brushed his. The space between them, which had been defined by duty, by law, by the hard facts of survival, had suddenly shrunk. It was no longer measured in feet, but in the sharp, magnetic pull of a thread. She dipped the rag. He didn't flinch when she touched the raw skin. He was a man accustomed to pain, a man who treated his own wounds as just another chore, like mending a fence or splitting wood. But this was different. Her touch was not practical. It was not the touch of a nurse. It was slow, careful. Her fingers were gentle as they worked the salt water into the wound. He watched her, his gray eyes unreadable, his jaw set. She focused on the task, on the dark line of the injury, on the strength of the forearm beneath her hands. She was tending to the man who had stood in the street and bought her life with his land, the man who had nailed a board over a broken window to seal out the night, the man who had placed his hand on her neck and anchored her when she was trembling. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the cloth on his skin and the ticking of the stove as it cooled.
He won't just let us walk into the chapel,
she said, her voice barely audible. She was speaking to his hand, not to him. No. Cassian replied, his voice a low rumble. He won't. He'll be watching the road. We're not taking the road. She finished cleaning the cut. It was angry, but it was clean. She took a fresh strip of linen and began to wrap it, starting at his wrist. Her fingers moved with a practiced, deliberate care. He did not move a muscle. He just watched her. The afternoon light was dying, turning the cabin a deep, bruised gold. She tied the knot, her fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary on his skin. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze.
"That morning," she said, her voice thick. "In Redwater Crossing, after you bought the bond, you told Maddox I was yours now."
He stiffened. The memory was hard. A brand of ownership. He started to pull his hand away, his face closing. But she did not let go. She kept her fingers resting on his bandaged wrist.
"I hated you for it,"
she whispered. It was just another chain. A different master. His eyes were dark, shadowed, anticipating the rest.
"But then,"
she continued, her voice breaking just a little. "Last night, when Maddox left, you told me, you said, 'It's still your home.' You didn't say it was your home. You said it was mine." She looked away from him then, toward the dying light in the window, at the golden dust motes that were now turning gray. "From the moment those chains went on, Cassian, I've heard them, every minute, even when they were off, when I slept, when I worked. Clink, drag, clink, drag, a sound in my head." She turned back to him, her eyes clear, devastatingly honest. "When you said that when you called it my home, the sound stopped, the chains went quiet." She had offered him the truest, most vulnerable part of herself. Cassian Rourke was a man built to endure. He was made of hard angles, silent work, and the acceptance of loss. He knew how to fix a fence, how to stop a wagon, how to face a gun. He did not know what to do with this. He did not know how to receive a thing so fragile and so whole. He was a man who knew how to withstand, but he had never been taught how to ask. He looked at her, his throat working. He was frozen by a vulnerability that was far more terrifying than Burke Maddox. Seeing his hesitation, seeing the stark loneliness in his eyes, the loneliness of a man who had never been offered a choice, Juniper acted. She had survived by being invisible. She had stayed alive on his ranch by being useful. Now, for the first time, she was simply present. Slowly, she let go of his bandaged wrist. She leaned forward, across the small space, and placed her free hand flat against his chest. It was a small, simple gesture, but in the quiet of that room, it was a thunderclap. She could feel him through the thick flannel of his shirt, the solid wall of his chest, and beneath it, the steady, powerful thump-thump of his heart. It was not the frantic, rabbit-quick beat of a man in fear, but the deep, measured rhythm of the land itself, solid, sure. He stopped breathing. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her hand, resting over his heart. Then, slowly, as if lifting a great weight, he raised his uninjured hand. He did not grab her. He did not pull her. He moved with an agonizing hesitation. He touched her face. His calloused fingers, rough as bark, gentle as dust, brushed the hair back from her cheek. He let his thumb rest just below her eye, tracing the bone. His eyes were dark, filled with a question he could not, or would not, speak aloud. He was asking, "May I?" And Juniper Vale, who had had everything taken from her, who had been dragged and accused and bartered for, gave him her answer. She nodded. It was not a small, hesitant movement. It was a clear, definite, certain inclination of her head. It was the first true choice she had made since she had ridden into the basin. It meant yes. It meant please. It meant I see you. That was all he needed. He leaned in. She met him halfway. They came together in the middle of the kitchen, which smelled of the cinnamon she had been grinding for the cornbread, and the sharp, clean scent of the sage tea. The first kiss was not a fire. It was a truce. It was slow and deep and profoundly unhurried. It was a discovery. His lips were chapped from the wind, but they were warm. Her mouth, which had only spoken words of fear and survival, yielded to his. There was a moment of stark, shared surprise. Oh, so this is what it is. And then the tension that had held them both rigid for weeks finally broke. Her hand, which was still on his chest, relaxed. His hand, which was cupping her face, cradled her jaw. Their breath mingled, a single, warm cloud in the cooling air. She felt the coiled springs in his shoulders, the ones that had held him upright against drought and loneliness. Finally, begin to unwind. He drew back, but only an inch. He rested his forehead against hers. They stood like that, breathing the same air, their eyes closed. "I won't own you, Juniper," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't know how to name. "What I said to Maddox, that was law. That was paper." He took a shuddering breath. "But this, I want to be allowed to choose you." He pressed his forehead harder against hers. "Every day, tomorrow, the day after, I want to wake up and choose you." A smile, slow and real, touched Juniper's lips. It was the first one that had ever reached her eyes. "Cassian," she whispered, and the sound of his name on her lips was a new thing. She slid her arms around his waist, her hands pressing flat against the solid plane of his back. She held on to him, not like a woman falling, but like a woman who had finally found purchase. This was not a rescue. This was an arrival. It felt, she thought, like what it must be to come home after a storm, to find the walls still standing. He wrapped his arms around her, his bandaged one and his good one, and pulled her tight. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of wood smoke and the sharp tang of the lye soap she'd used that morning. They just stood there, holding each other, as the last of the light died and the cabin sank into deep shadow. Later, they sat by the fire. The storm lantern was turned down low, casting soft, warm light on the hearth. The papers, the evidence, were put away, forgotten for the night. They talked. They whispered of things that had never been spoken aloud. He told her, in clipped, hard sentences, about the drought, about the fire that had taken his barn and his herd, about the silence of the following winter, and the sound of the wind, and how he had marked the days on the post just to hear the scratch of the chalk. She told him about her father's small holding, about the gray Sweetwater River, about the 2 years she had spent working for Hadley, saving her wages, dreaming of a small piece of land, a place where she didn't have to be invisible. They were not grand stories. They were the small, hard truths of their lives. With every word, they passed a piece of themselves to the other, a currency of trust. His hand found hers in the shadows, his large, rough fingers interlaced with her smaller, capable ones. It was a simple, solid connection, a promise. The night deepened. The fire burned down to glowing red embers, and the cabin was filled with a safe, encompassing warmth. That night, they were together. It was a night of profound, gentle quiet. It was made of more slow kisses, and the clasp of their hands, and the shared warmth under the heavy wool blankets. His heavy canvas coat, the one she had worn for protection, the one that still smelled of hay and wind, was shed, falling onto the chair by the cot. The wind howled on the mesa, a lonely, searching sound. But inside the small, sturdy cabin, there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of 2 people breathing in unison. The door to that last, most private place was closed, not with a lock, but with mutual respect and a whispered, absolute agreement. It was not a taking, but a giving. It was shelter, found in the most unlikely of places. When the first cold gray light of Sunday morning crept into the cabin, Juniper was already awake. She lay for a high, quiet moment, watching the man beside her. In sleep. Cassian's face was not hard. The lines of worry and enduring were smoothed away. He looked younger. He looked she thought, at peace. She slipped from the cot, pulling the blanket over his shoulder. She dressed in the clothes he had given her, the clothes that now felt like her own. She did not make coffee. She did not stir the fire. She let him sleep. She found the stub of his pencil, the one he used for his calendar, and a scrap of clean paper. Her hand was steady. She did not write a letter of love. She wrote a statement of fact. Meet you at the chapel. We choose the truth. She left the note on the table, next to his tin mug. She stepped out onto the porch. The air was frigid, sharp as a razor, but the sky to the east was a clear, promising blue. She took a deep breath, and for the first time, it did not hurt. Inside, 10 minutes later, Cassian woke. He woke as he always did, all at once, his senses alert. He saw the empty space beside him, and for a half-second, a cold, familiar dread gripped him. Then he saw the note. He read the 6 words. He went to the table and picked up the oilcloth packet of evidence. He tucked it carefully into a worn leather folder, the one that held the deed to his land, his 2 most valuable possessions. He stood in the center of the quiet room. He looked at the note again. The corner of his mouth twitched. It was almost a smile. And it was not the expression of a man who was alone. The Wheat Chapel was not a large building. It was built of pine and faith, and on this Sunday, it was packed so tight the air was hot and smelled of dust, old wool, and the faint, sweet scent of hymn books. Pastor Abel Whitlow stood at the pulpit. He was a thin, earnest man who believed in a merciful God, but he was facing a congregation that was restless and sharp-edged. He opened the heavy Bible, its pages whispering. "We gather this morning," he began, his voice straining to be heard over the shuffling and whispering, "to reflect on the parable of the—" He stopped. The heavy chapel door had swung open, its hinges groaning in protest. The whispers died instantly. The shuffling ceased. Every head in the chapel turned. Cassian Rourke stood in the doorway. He was not dressed for church. He wore his canvas duster. His boots were clean but worn, and his face was hard. He held the door, and a moment later, Juniper Vale stepped inside. She wore the simple calico dress she'd been given. Her hair was clean and pulled back, and the bruises on her face had faded. But it was her eyes that held them. They were not the eyes of a frightened girl. They were the eyes of a woman who had walked through a fire and come out the other side. Cassian stepped in behind her, and they walked. Not to the back pew, but down the center aisle. The townspeople parted like water. In the front row, Eustace Hadley sat with his arms crossed, his chin high, projecting an air of bored arrogance. Beside him, Judge Orville Pike nervously polished his spectacles, a small, damp sheen on his upper lip. And at the end of the pew, blocking the aisle, sat Sheriff Burke Maddox. His uniform was pressed, his badge polished. He looked at the approaching pair with a cold, satisfied smirk. Cassian and Juniper did not stop at a pew. They walked all the way to the front, stopping in the open space between the congregation and the pulpit, directly in front of the 3 men. The silence was absolute. It was a suffocating, ringing void. Pastor Whitlow cleared his throat, his gaze flicking from Cassian to the sheriff. "Mr. Rourke, Miss Vale, this is a house of worship. We are beginning our service." "We know, Pastor," Cassian said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the small room, clear and cold as iron. "We're not here to disrupt the service. We're here under the right of community assembly." The right of what?" Pike interjected, his voice high and thin. "The right of a citizen to bring a grievance before the assembled community." Cassian stated. He was not looking at Pike. He was looking at the pastor. "The law has failed, Pastor, so we are bringing the truth to the people." "This is not a courtroom," Pike snapped, half rising from his seat. "Sit down, Orville." Maddox grunted, pulling him back. The sheriff's eyes were fixed on Cassian, glittering with malice. "Let him speak."
Let the whole town hear this nonsense before I arrest them both for disturbing the peace." Pastor Whitlow looked at the hard faces in his front pew. He looked at the dozens of expectant, fearful faces in the congregation. He looked at Cassian, a man he knew to be honest, and at Juniper, a girl he had seen dragged in chains. "The chapel," the pastor said slowly, his voice finding its strength, "is a house of truth. The law of this county and the law of God both demand that the truth be heard." He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "You may speak, Mr. Rourke, but speak plainly." Cassian turned, not to the pastor, but to the town. "You all know what she is accused of," he said. "You all stood in the street and watched her be dragged. Now you'll listen to what happened." He nodded to Juniper. Juniper stepped forward. She was trembling, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "I was in the tack room," she began, her eyes scanning the faces. She saw May Albright, her hands clasped. She saw Gideon Pike, standing at the back, his massive arms crossed. "I was sent to fetch a bridle for Mr. Hadley." Hadley shifted, his arrogance faltering, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "I heard a sound," Juniper continued. "A barrel, being dropped. I smelled something, not kerosene. It was pine tar, thick like a railroad tie yard. I went to look. I saw a man in a brown hat running out the east door. He ran toward the creek. As he ran, the entire north wall of the haymow went up. A whoosh. It wasn't a lantern fire. It was an ocean of fire, all at once." She was reliving it, her voice gaining a desperate clarity. "I dropped my lantern then. I ran, and Sheriff Maddox, he was just there, in the street, waiting." A low, uneasy murmur rippled through the pews. "And what else?" Cassian prompted, his voice low. "The 9:30 cargo train," she said, her gaze finding Maddox. "I heard the whistle from Kestrel Depot just before the barrel thump, and there were tracks near the east door, not boot prints, horseshoe tracks, from a heavy-gaited horse." "Lies," Hadley suddenly boomed, his face red. "A fantasy. The girl is a convicted and accused firebug. She'd say anything." "She would," Cassian agreed, his voice cutting through Hadley's, "which is why we didn't just bring her story." He stepped up to the communion table. Next to the open Bible, he laid down the worn leather folder. "We bring proof." He untied the flap. He pulled out the first document. "This," he said, holding it up, "is Mr. Hadley's new insurance policy for $5,000. Enough to build a palace, not a barn. It's dated 2 days before the fire." The murmur grew louder. Hadley's face went from red to a pale, pasty white. "He's right to be insured," Slate, Hadley's foreman, yelled from the middle of the crowd. "He's a careful man." "He is," Cassian agreed. He pulled out the second paper. "This is a map, drawn by Mr. Hadley's own hand, a map of his stockyards, with a note, 'Move prime stock to high pasture Tuesday,' and another note, right over the main barn." He held it up so the front rows could see the circled building. "Clear Section B, Wednesday." He let the words hang. He moved his valuable animals. He cleared out the section he planned to burn. The fire was on Thursday. "That proves nothing," Pike squeaked, standing up now. "Prudent planning, Sheriff. This is an outrage." "And this," Cassian said, his voice dropping, "is why the judge is so nervous." He pulled out the final letter. He held up the paper with the official judiciary seal. "This is a letter from Judge Orville Pike to Eustace Hadley." The chapel went dead silent. "It details the plan," Cassian said, his voice like a hammer. "It congratulates Hadley on the matter being handled. It confirms the quarry transport papers are ready, and it promises to dismiss the trial once the insurance draft from Denver is secured." He laid the letter on the pulpit, on top of the open Bible. "It's a lie," Pike shrieked, his face contorted. "A forgery, a slander, Sheriff. Arrest this man."
It ain't a forgery, a voice yelled from the crowd.
It was Slate. He was standing, his weasel face slick with sweat. He was pointing at Cassian. That map ain't even right. Hadley didn't clear Section B. I was just checking the perimeter. We was just making sure it was empty, like he told me.
The words, meant as a defense, hit the room like a confession. He had just admitted to being there, preparing the barn, just before the fire. You were checking, May Albright's voice, thin but strong, rose from the third pew. She stood up, her hands shaking.
Checking what? Mr. Slate, checking on the tar.
What tar? Slate stammered. The 2 barrels of railroad-grade pine tar, May said, her eyes fixed on Eustace Hadley. The 2 barrels I saw Mr. Hadley sign for at the Mercantile, the day before the fire. The room exploded. It wasn't a shout. It was a single, collective gasp of understanding. The whole story, the whole conspiracy, was now laid bare. This is not a trial, Pike bellowed, his voice cracking. This meeting, this assembly is disbanded. Go home, Sheriff. Clear the room. Burke Maddox moved. He had been coiled, waiting. This was his moment. He strode forward, his hand on his pistol. He wasn't going for Cassian. He was going for Juniper. You, he snarled, pointing at her. You're done. You've deceived this town. You've mocked the law. You're coming with me. He reached out, his hand open, to grab her arm. Cassian moved faster. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped between them. He was a wall. Maddox's hand, expecting to find the girl's arm, slammed into the solid, unmoving wall of Cassian's chest. Get out of my way, Rourke. No. That girl is my prisoner. You're interfering. That voids your bond. She is my surety, Cassian said, his voice low and deadly. She is a member of this community, and you are an officer of a corrupt court. He looked at Maddox, his gray eyes flat and cold. You touch her, he said, each word a spike. And you're not just touching me. You're touching the law of this entire community. You're touching every person in this room. Maddox froze. He looked past Cassian at the faces. They were no longer afraid. They were hard. They were angry. They were watching him. He was one man, and he was, for the first time, outnumbered. This is mob rule, Pike shrieked from the pulpit. No, Judge, a new voice boomed from the back. The crowd parted. Gideon Pike, the blacksmith, walked down the aisle. His face was a mask of grim duty. In his hand, he held a single, oddly shaped horseshoe nail. He walked to the front and stopped, not by Cassian, but by his uncle. This ain't mob rule, Uncle Orville, Gideon said, his voice heavy with shame. It's just the truth. He held up the nail. I found this by the east door of Hadley's barn, the morning after the fire, right where the girl said she saw the man run. It's a custom, cold-forged nail. He turned and looked at Eustace Hadley. It's from a set I made myself, a special order, for your prize mare, Mr. Hadley, the one with the weak hoof. There ain't another set like it in this county. That was it, the final, physical, undeniable link. Eustace Hadley looked at the nail, at his foreman, at the judge, and he crumpled. He didn't faint. He just seemed to collapse inward, his arrogance gone, replaced by the hollow, sick look of a trapped man. Pike looked at the nail, his face ashen. He was finished. Pastor Abel Whitlow stepped forward. He closed the Bible. This is no longer just a house of worship, he said, his voice ringing with a new, profound authority. It is now a house of public record. He moved to a small desk at the side and retrieved the heavy, leather-bound book, the official county register. The evidence presented, the testimony given, it will be recorded, here, today, and it will be witnessed. He opened the book to a new, blank page. He wrote the date. The community has heard, he said. The community will now stand as witness. We, the people of Dry Arrow Basin, demand that these charges against Juniper Vale be struck. We demand that the actions of Judge Orville Pike, Sheriff Burke Maddox, and Eustace Hadley be investigated by a higher authority." He looked at his congregation. "We will send this record and this evidence to the U.S. Marshal in Silver Ledge." He signed his name, the first witness. "Who will sign?" May Albright was the first. She walked up, took the pen, and signed her name. Then Gideon Pike. He signed, his large, blocky letters a stark contrast to the pastor's. Then Mr. Henderson from the Mercantile. Then 2 ranchers from the South Valley. Then a mother of 4, one by one. The townspeople rose from the pews and formed a line. A silent, damning parade, to put their names on the public record. It was over. The law had been tried by the people, and it had been found wanting. Judge Pike stood alone, trembling. Hadley had sunk into the pew, his head in his hands. Sheriff Burke Maddox was shaking with a different emotion. It was pure, unadulterated rage. He was beaten, he was exposed, and he was powerless. He looked at Cassian. He looked at Juniper, who was standing beside him, her hand gripping his arm. He said nothing. He just backed away, step by step. He reached the aisle, turned, and strode from the chapel, his boots striking the floor like hammer blows. He shoved the door open, and it slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing the finality of his defeat. But just before it closed, Juniper heard his last, snarled words, ripped from his throat and carried on the wind. "This ain't over." They returned from the chapel not in triumph, but in a tense, brittle quiet. The victory in the Wheat Chapel was a legal one, a moral one, but it felt hollow. They had shown their hand, and now Burke Maddox and Eustace Hadley, men who had nothing left to lose, had 2 full days to answer. The first answer came from the sky. On Monday, the air changed. The wind, which had been a cool whisper from the north, died completely. The sky, normally a sharp, high mesa blue, turned a sick, sulphurous yellow. A curtain of ochre dust, visible from 20 miles away, was rising from the Redwind Flats to the south. "A duster," Cassian said, his voice flat. He was on the roof, replacing the shingles torn by the wind. He stopped hammering and tasted the air. It was gritty, charged with a static he could feel on his skin. Juniper, who was restringing the laundry line, paused. The silence was unnatural. Even the birds were gone. "How bad?" "It's a bad one," he said. "Get the horses into the barn. Fill every bucket, every trough. We'll have to board the main window again." They worked for an hour, the light growing dimmer, the world turning a diseased shade of orange. They sealed the house, stuffing rags into the cracks around the doors. The air grew so thick it was hard to breathe. Then came the sound. It was not the wind. The wind was a high, thin scream, but under it was a new sound. It was a low, rolling vibration, a rumble that came not through the air, but through the earth. Tinder, the old hound, sprang up from the porch, a low, terrified whine in his throat. "What is that?" Juniper whispered, her hand on the dog's neck. "Thunder," Cassian said, but his face was grim. He knew it wasn't. He ran to the windmill, scrambling up the ladder, his boots ringing on the metal rungs. He clung to the top, the wind ripping at his coat, and squinted into the yellow-black wall of dust that was now only a mile away. He saw it. It was not a storm. It was an army. A black, rolling mass of horns and hide, 500, maybe 600 head of cattle, was moving inside the storm. And they were not just moving, they were running. Behind them, barely visible in the choking dust, were 3 riders, their hats pulled low, waving slicks in the air, pushing the herd, driving it. They were using the storm as cover. They were aiming Hadley's entire remaining herd directly at Larkspur Ridge. "It's a stampede," he roared, sliding down the ladder, his hands burning. "It's Maddox." Juniper's face went white.
The fence! The new fence!
Won't even slow them, he said, grabbing her arm, pulling her toward the house. They'll trample it. They'll hit the barn. They'll hit the house. They'll wipe us off the map. And Hadley will call it an act of God, a tragic accident. She tore her arm from his grasp.
No, I won't hide. We fight them.
He looked at her, his eyes catching the strange, hellish light. She was right. Hiding was death. A plan, he said, his mind racing.
The herd is blind. They're running on fear. They'll follow a leader, or they'll turn from a barrier.
The barrier, she said. The leader, he said, at the same time. They looked at each other. They would do both. Juniper, he commanded. Get Winterglass. And the mare. That filly is fast enough to lead. Take them to the Blue Notch. He pointed to the narrow, rocky gap to the north. If you can get in front of them, they'll follow a horse. They'll break, and you can lead them into the rocks. They'll scatter in the canyon.
And you,
she cried over the rising wind. I'm the barrier, he yelled. He ran to the barn, grabbing a pitchfork and 2 empty kerosene cans. I'll make a cold fire smoke if I can split the front line. Some will go to you, some will go south. Go, there's no time. She didn't argue. She ran for the barn. For Winterglass, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The world dissolved. The dust storm hit Larkspur Ridge not as weather, but as a physical impact. It was a wave of flying gravel and sand that stung like birdshot. The sun was gone, replaced by a screaming, suffocating night. Juniper, her face wrapped in a wet cloth, led the 2 horses from the barn. Winterglass was frantic, her eyes rolling, but she trusted Juniper's hand. Juniper swung into the saddle. She couldn't see 10 feet. She could only hear. The earth thunder was no longer a rumble. It was a deafening, continuous roar, the sound of 1,000 freight trains, the sound of the world tearing apart. She gave Winterglass her head and kicked her, riding not away from the sound, but parallel to it. She had to find the front of the herd. She had to get ahead. She leaned low over the mare's neck, the wind trying to peel her from the saddle. Fly, girl, she screamed into the storm. Winterglass, a creature of pure nerve, stretched out, a pale ghost against the black dust. Juniper whistled, a high, piercing note that her father had taught her, a sound designed to cut through wind. To her left, a shape solidified, a massive, long-horned steer, its red eyes mad with terror, appeared not 10 feet from her, then another, and another. She was in it. She was in the stampede. She yanked Winterglass's head to the right, avoiding being crushed, then spurred her again. Pushing for more speed, she was racing the leaders. For a terrifying, heart-stopping minute, she was neck and neck with the panicked beasts. Then, slowly, agonizingly, Winterglass began to pull ahead. She was in front. She whistled again, that high, cutting sound. The lead steers, blind and desperate for a direction, for anything other than the terror pushing them from behind, heard her. One steer, the leader, turned its head, its momentum shifting. It veered, following the sound, following the pale, fast-moving shape in the gloom. The herd began to part, like a wave splitting on a rock. The front line of the stampede broke, a full third of the animals turning to follow the ghost horse into the rocky maw of Blue Notch. But the main herd, the other 2/3, was still aimed at the ranch. Cassian was at the fence line. He was a demon in the storm, working with a grim, focused fury. He had dumped the damp straw from the barn in a long 20-yard line, soaked it in just enough kerosene to make it smolder. He lit it. It wasn't a hot fire. It was a cold fire. It produced a wall of thick, choking, acrid smoke that the wind grabbed and flattened, turning it into a low, impenetrable barrier. The first of the remaining herd hit it. They smelled the smoke. They couldn't see through it. They slowed, bellowing in confusion. The front line stopped, turning, trying to go south, away from the smoke. It was working. He was turning them. But the pressure from behind was too great. The new fence, built by the community, was holding. But the posts were groaning, leaning at an impossible angle. The wire was screaming. A high-pitched note of metal stretched to its breaking point. "Hold," Cassian grunted, throwing his own weight against the main corner post. "Hold, damn you!" A surge of cattle, a dozen head, pushed by the blind panic behind them, hit the fence line just north of his smoke. There was a sound like a pistol shot as the wire snapped. A post splintered. And they were through. A wall of black hide and horns was on him. Cassian turned to dive, but his boot, the one that had been braced against the post, caught in the tangle of snapped wire. He stumbled, falling hard to one knee. He looked up. He saw the rolling red eyes, the flaring nostrils. He had no time. He was dead. Juniper had seen it. She had diverted her part of the herd. She was turning Winterglass back when she saw the fence break. She saw Cassian's dark shape, the smoke flag he'd been holding, disappear. Her heart did not jump. It did not pound. It just stopped. She did not think. She acted. "Ah!" she screamed. A raw, primal sound ripped from her lungs. She spurred Winterglass, driving the mare back, not at the herd, but at him. The mare, sensing the life-or-death urgency, covered the 50 yards in 4 leaps. The steers were 10 yards from him. 5. Juniper didn't slow. She didn't try to stop. She rode Winterglass straight at Cassian. She leaned impossibly low from the saddle, her arm outstretched, her fingers locking onto the collar of his heavy duster. She didn't try to pull him up. There was no time. She just pulled. The force of the charging horse, combined with her grip, yanked Cassian free of the wire and dragged him sideways. He was torn from his feet as the two of us, man and horse, crashed past him. They rolled, a tangle of limbs, as a dozen 2,000-pound animals thundered over the exact spot where he had been kneeling, their hooves churning the earth into a muddy ruin. Then, as quickly as it came, it was over. The herd was past. The sound, the earth thunder, was fading, moving north, a retreating monster. The dust cloud moved with it, and the world slowly, blessedly, began to reappear. There was no sound but the high, thin whine of the wind and the gasping, choked breathing of 2 people on the ground. The cabin was standing. The barn was standing. The pasture was gone. It was obliterated, scoured down to the bedrock, the fences simply erased. Juniper pushed herself to her knees. She was covered in filth, shaking so hard she couldn't stand. Cassian was 2 feet away. He was alive. He pushed himself up onto his elbows. His face was scraped raw from the gravel. He looked at the ruined land. He looked at the standing house. Then he looked at her. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He just held out his arms. She crawled the last 2 feet and collapsed against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. They knelt there, in the middle of their ruined land, and just held on, their hearts hammering against each other. After a long minute, Cassian's gaze lifted. He looked up at the high ridge to the south. The dust was settling. 2 riders sat their horses, silhouetted against the dying yellow light. They were just watching. Even from a mile away, the arrogant slump of one man and the military straightness of the other were unmistakable. Eustace Hadley and Burke Maddox. Their act of God had failed. As the 2 men turned their horses to leave, Juniper, following his gaze, pushed herself free. Her eyes, sharp and practiced, scanned the ridge where they had been. She walked, her legs unsteady, toward the ridge. "Juniper!" She didn't answer. She climbed the short rise. She found what she was looking for, lying on a flat rock. Its end, still slightly warm, was a half-smoked cigar. The band was a dark, rich red with gold lettering, Hadley's custom order from St. Louis. She picked it up,
wrapped it in her neckerchief, and tucked it away. Another piece. By evening, the wind was gone, the air was calm, the sky a clear, bruised purple. The desolation was complete. They were surveying the damage, the miles of fencing they would have to rebuild, when a new sound came. A wagon. Cassian's hand went to the pistol in his belt. "No," Juniper said, touching his arm. "Listen." The wagon was slow, and someone was whistling. It was Gideon Pike, and in the wagon with him were May Albright and 2 other ranchers from the South Valley. The wagon was loaded with new pine posts and spools of wire. "Heard the wind," Gideon said as he pulled up. He didn't ask what happened. He just nodded at the ruined ground. "Figured your fences took a beating, the stampede." "We saw the riders, Mr. Rourke," May said, climbing down. She carried a basket. "They came right past my boarding house, bragging. We came as soon as the wind died." 2 small children, May's niece and nephew, peeked out from the back of the wagon. They were carrying small bundles of baling ties. "You stay by the wagon, now," May told them, her voice firm but kind. "Just hand the wire to Mr. Gideon when he asks." The community, it wasn't just words in a book. It was here. It was hauling posts. It was bringing fresh-baked bread. The sun was setting as they hammered the last post. A fire red, glorious end to a terrible day. The wagon was gone, the neighbors having returned to their own chores, promising to come back tomorrow. Cassian and Juniper stood on the porch, watching the color drain from the sky. Tinder, the old hound, who had hidden under the porch for the entire stampede, was now asleep at their feet, his tail thumping softly in a dream. It was quiet. "Juniper," Cassian said. His voice was rough. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, his hands working a small, dark object. He had been braiding it. She realized, as the others worked. "I am not a man for big words," he said, looking at his own hands. "Or for promises. The future, it's always felt like a debt you can't pay. It's just the next thing that's trying to kill you." He stepped toward her, into the fading light. He was holding a small, braided circle of dark boot leather. It was not pretty. It was sturdy. It was made by his own calloused hands. He took her left hand. It was raw, rope-burned, and smeared with dirt. "I can't promise you next year," he whispered, his voice thick. "I can't promise you forever. This land, this life, it don't allow for it." He looked up, and his gray eyes, in the twilight, were clear and devastatingly sincere. "But I can promise you tomorrow." He slid the simple leather loop onto her ring finger. It fit perfectly. "I promise I'll wake up," he said. "And I'll still be here. I'll be here. And I'll choose you again. That's the only promise I know how to keep." She looked at the ring, then at his face. Her eyes were shining, not with tears, but with the reflected, dying light of the sunset. She was so full of emotion, she couldn't speak. She just nodded, a soft, clear, certain movement. She raised her hand, the leather ring dark against her skin, and touched his rough cheek. And she smiled. Tinder sighed in his sleep. The first stars pricked the purple sky. The peace was complete. Clang, clang, clang! The sound was sharp, metallic, angry. It carried on the cold, clear air from town. It wasn't the chapel bell. It was Gideon's anvil. The alarm, 3 sharp rings. Danger, invasion. Cassian and Juniper's heads snapped up. The new promise, not 5 seconds old, was already under attack. Clang, clang, clang! "Gideon," Cassian said, his voice a low growl. "It's the warning." As if summoned by the bell, a lone rider crested the ridge from Redwater Crossing, pushing his horse. Not at a run, but at a panicked, stumbling gallop. It was Deputy Lyle Bracken. He didn't slow, but crashed into the yard, pulling his horse up so hard it reared. "Rourke, Rourke," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. You gotta run!"
What is it, Lyle? Cassian said, stepping off the porch, his hand on Juniper's arm, keeping her behind him.
It's Maddox,
Bracken gasped, his chest heaving.
He did it. After the chapel, he telegraphed Silver Ledge. He didn't ask for a marshal.
What did he do? Lyle. He told them the town was in armed revolt. He said the judiciary had been overthrown by force. He said you were leading an insurrection. Bracken pointed back toward the pass, his hands shaking. He's not just bringing county law. Rourke, he got his order. He's bringing the army. The dawn of Tuesday was cold and sharp, a blade of pale light against the eastern peaks. The wait was agonizing. Lyle Bracken's warning had settled over the ranch like a shroud. They were not just fighting Maddox now. They were fighting the United States government. They didn't have to wait long. The sound came just after 7, carried on the clear, cold air horses. Not 2 or 3, a dozen, maybe more. Cassian stepped onto the porch. Juniper was right behind him, the leather ring on her finger a small, dark anchor. She carried the leather folder with their evidence. They came up the switchback, not from the south, but from the high pass to the west, from Silver Ledge. But it was not the blue-coated cavalry. It was 8 men, hard-faced and weary, wearing long canvas dusters. Their badges were pinned to their vests, not their coats. Marshals. And riding at the front, his face a mask of smug, triumphant rage, was Sheriff Burke Maddox. Beside him, looking pale and nervous, was Eustace Hadley. "That's them, Marshal," Maddox boomed, pointing at the porch. "That's Rourke, and that's the girl, the ringleaders of the insurrection." The lead marshal, a tall, older man with eyes the color of a winter sky, held up his hand. The column stopped. He looked at Cassian, at Juniper, at the patched door, at the newly set fence posts, at the ruined pasture. His gaze missed nothing. "I am Marshal Thorne," he said, his voice like gravel. "I have a warrant here for the arrest of Juniper Vale and one Cassian Rourke on charges of sedition, incitement of a riot, and interfering with the county judiciary." Maddox smiled, a wide, wolfish grin. "Federal support," he said under his breath, loud enough for Cassian to hear. "Told you." Cassian did not look at Maddox. He looked at Marshal Thorne. "You've been misinformed, Marshal," Cassian said, his voice steady. "He's armed," Maddox yelled. "I'm on my own property," Cassian said, not moving. "And you have been lied to? There was no riot. There was no insurrection. There was a public hearing, and we have the minutes." He held up the leather folder. "This isn't a confession, Marshal. It's an indictment, signed by the entire community. Pastor Whitlow, May Albright, Gideon Pike, 25 names, all testifying to the real crime." Thorne's eyes narrowed. He was not a man who enjoyed being lied to. He looked at Maddox, whose smile had faltered. "An indictment," Thorne said, "of Sheriff Maddox, Judge Pike, and Eustace Hadley," Juniper said, her voice clear and strong, "for conspiracy, insurance fraud, and attempted murder." The marshal held out his gloved hand. "The folder." Cassian walked down the steps and handed it to him. Thorne sat on his horse, the wind ruffling the pages as he read. He read the summary from Pastor Whitlow. He read the list of names. He read the transcript of Judge Pike's letter. His face, already hard, turned to granite. He folded the papers and tucked them inside his own coat. He looked at Maddox, his eyes flat and cold. "Sheriff," he said, "your telegraph stated that the town hall was burned and the courthouse under siege." He gestured to the quiet ranch, the rising smoke from the chimney. "This does not look like an insurrection." "They're liars," Hadley blurted from the back. They forged it all." "Then they're very good," Thorne said. "And the entire town is in on it. This stinks. I'm not here to put down a rebellion. Sheriff, I'm here to find the law." He swung down from his horse. "We're not having a war," Marshal Thorne declared. "We're having a hearing, right now, in town." He pointed at Maddox and Hadley. "You two, you're part of this. And you," he said to Cassian and Juniper, "bring your witnesses." He turned to his deputies. "We ride for Redwater Crossing, now." The post office was too small. It was hot, packed, and smelled of mail sacks, stove smoke, and fear. The entire town, it seemed, had crammed inside, their face pale and anxious. Marshal Thorne had commandeered the postmaster's desk. He sat behind it. The federal authority. He had 2 deputies by the door. Eustace Hadley and a trembling, ashen-faced Judge Pike were forced to sit on a mail bench, like common defendants. Burke Maddox stood by the wall, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud. "I have read the community document," Thorne began, his voice silencing the room. "And I have read the letter attributed to Judge Pike. This is an emergency tribunal. We will hear the testimony. Miss Vale, you will speak." Juniper stood. She was not the girl who had been dragged in chains. She was a woman. She told her story, not with the fear of a victim, but with the cold, clear precision of a witness. She laid out the timeline, the smell of tar, the sound of the 9:30 train, the man in the brown hat. Then she placed the evidence on the desk, the insurance policy, the hand-drawn map, and last, the letter. "That is my testimony," she finished. Thorne looked at the letter. "Judge Pike, is this your signature?" "It is a vile forgery," Pike squeaked, beads of sweat on his forehead. I have never seen it. This woman, she is a known firebug." "Mrs. Albright," Thorne said, not looking at Pike. May stood, her hands clasped. "I saw Mr. Hadley sign the receipt for 2 barrels of pine tar, Marshal, the day before the fire." "Mr. Gideon Pike." Gideon stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the light. He dropped the custom horseshoe nail on the desk. "Found this by the east gate, where the man ran. I made it. For Mr. Hadley's mare. Made it myself 2 weeks ago." The room was silent. The links of the chain were being forged, one by one. Thorne looked at the pile of evidence. He looked at Hadley, who was staring at his boots. "Marshal," Hadley said, his voice oily. "This is all circumstance. A disgruntled girl, a busybody, a blacksmith with a grudge. There is no proof." "I agree," Thorne said. He turned to the crowd. "Where's the foreman? Mr. Slate." A small, choked sound came from the back. Slate was trying to shrink behind a farmer. "Mr. Slate," Thorne's voice boomed. "Step forward." Shaking, Slate was pushed to the front. He stood there, his eyes darting between Hadley, Maddox, and the marshal. He was a trapped rat. "Mr. Slate," Thorne said, his voice deceptively calm. "You were Mr. Hadley's foreman. Did you, at any time, see this pine tar on the property?" Slate licked his lips. I know, no, sir." "Did you participate in the burning of the barn?"
"No, never. I wouldn't."
"Did Mr. Hadley pay you to keep quiet about the fire?" Slate looked at Hadley. Hadley gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Deny it." But Slate was looking at the federal badge. He said it was a bonus," Slate stammered. "A bonus for what?" Thorne pressed. For just being quiet about the drifter, Jed." The room inhaled. "What about the drifter, Jed?" Thorne asked, leaning forward. He's the one who lit the match," Slate burst out, the words tumbling over each other in his panic. "Mr. Hadley hired him. He hired him to clean up the old barn. I just made sure no one was around. I just did what Mr. Hadley told me. The extra $100, it was just to keep quiet. I didn't do it. He did." He pointed a shaking finger at Eustace Hadley. It was over. The confession, desperate and pathetic, hung in the hot, still air. Judge Pike slumped, his face gray. Hadley looked like he was going to be sick. Burke Maddox, however, did not slump. He exploded. He did not see a collapsed conspiracy. He saw the source of his humiliation. He saw the girl who had brought it all down. "You!" he roared, his voice cracking with pure, primal rage. He lunged, not at Slate, not at Hadley, but at Juniper. He crossed the 2 feet between them, his hand a claw, grabbing her arm. "You little witch, I'll see you." He was fast, but Cassian was solid. Cassian didn't strike him. He simply moved, intercepting the lunge, his body a block of stone. He seized Maddox's wrist, his grip like a blacksmith's vice, and tore the sheriff's hand from Juniper's arm. He pushed Juniper behind him. "Get your hands off her," Cassian growled. Maddox, blind with fury, tried to swing at Cassian. Cassian just held him, his arm a steel bar. He looked the sheriff dead in the eye, his voice low and cutting. "She is under my surety. Sheriff," he said, the words echoing the ones he'd spoken in the street, weeks ago. "She is under my protection, unless you mean to defy the law you're sworn to, right in front of a federal marshal." "He's right, Burke," Marshal Thorne said, his voice like a death knell. He was on his feet, his pistol drawn. "And you, sir, are interfering with a federal witness. You are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and assault." He nodded to his deputies. "Cuff him." The moment was stunning. The town watched, breathless. As the federal deputies seized Burke Maddox, he struggled, roaring, but they were professionals. They pinned his arms and locked the iron cuffs on his wrists. "You can't do this," Maddox bellowed. "It's done," Thorne said. He turned to the trembling Judge Pike. "Judge, your judicial seal, I'll take it. You are suspended, pending a federal investigation." All eyes were on the transfer of power. On Maddox, defeated. On Pike, broken. All eyes, except Cassian's. "He's gone," Cassian said, his voice a low warning. Juniper turned. The mail bench was empty. Eustace Hadley had bolted. "He's out the back," someone yelled. Juniper didn't wait for the marshal. She was out the door before anyone else moved. She had left Winterglass tied to the rail. She was in the saddle in a single, fluid motion, yanking the reins, the mare rearing. Cassian was right behind her, mounting his own bay. "He's headed for the river." They galloped through the center of Redwater Crossing, scattering chickens. Hadley was 100 yards ahead, pushing his prize mare, the one with the custom shoes, to its limit. He was a good rider, and his horse was fast. He was heading for the only way out of the basin to the south, the old Foxspan Bridge. They thundered down the river road, the gap closing. Winterglass was faster. Juniper was gaining on him. Hadley heard her. He looked back, his face a mask of terror. He reached the wooden bridge, his horse's hooves pounding on the old planks. He pulled his pistol. He didn't aim at her. He fired wildly, into the air, a desperate, panicked sound. "Bang, bang, stay back, or I'll—" He never finished. The bridge was old, rotten from a decade of floods. The panic of the galloping horse, the percussive shock of the gunfire, it was too much. There was a high, tearing, splintering sound. A main support beam snapped. The bridge did not collapse all at once. It tilted, a dying, groaning thing. Hadley's mare screamed, trying to find purchase on the falling planks. She was thrown, and Hadley was pitched from the saddle. He fell. He didn't hit the water. He landed with a thick, wet thwack in the deep, sucking mud of the low-tide riverbank. He was unhurt. He was just stuck, a leather satchel, the one with his personal papers, his stock certificates, fell beside him, landing in the filth. Juniper and Cassian reined in hard on the safe side of the bank. The bridge was gone. Hadley looked up, his fine suit ruined, his face smeared with black mud. He tried to stand, but his boots were held fast. He was pathetic. "Help me," he whined. "I'm stuck, get me out." Juniper looked at him. She had the Winchester in her saddle scabbard. She had been dragged. She had been hunted. She had been nearly crushed by his cattle. She looked at the man who had tried to end her life. She did not reach for the rifle. She uncoiled the lariat from her saddle horn. She built a loop, her movements economical and sure. With a single sharp snap of her wrist, she threw it. The rope sailed out and settled perfectly over his chest and shoulders. "Pull," she said to Cassian. Together, they backed their horses, dragging Eustace Hadley, sputtering and cursing, from the mud like a hooked fish. When they returned to the post office, the town was waiting. A defeated, filthy Hadley was shoved in front of the marshal. He confessed. He confessed it all. The insurance, the drifter, Jed, the conspiracy with Pike and Maddox to get rid of the girl. He confessed it all in a flat, whining monotone, his eyes on the floor. Marshal Thorne looked at the assembled crowd. "By the authority of the United States government," he declared, "all charges against Miss Juniper Vale are hereby dropped. She is cleared." A wave of applause, of sheer, giddy relief, swept the small room. Thorne waited for it to die down. He looked at Juniper, and his stern face softened. "Just a fraction." "Miss Vale," he said, his voice kind, "you are a free woman, but it may be wise for you to move on. This town holds difficult memories. My deputies can provide an escort to Silver Ledge. It's a bigger town, a fresh start." This was it, the final crossroad. She could leave. She could be safe. She could forget Larkspur Ridge, the chains, the terror. She looked at May, who was smiling through her tears. She looked at Gideon, who nodded at her, a look of profound respect on his face. This was her town. They had signed their names for her. Then she looked at Cassian. He was standing by the door, his gaze not on her, but on the outside, on the high mesa visible in the distance. He looked like he was already preparing to ride home, alone. "He's right," Cassian said, his voice low, not looking at her. "You could go. Be safe." He paused, then turned to her. His gray eyes were stripped bare of all their defenses. "Or," he said, his voice so quiet only she could hear it, "you could stay, here, with me." He looked at his hands, then back at her. Unless you've had enough of this hard country." The unless. It was not a threat. It was not a bargain. It was an offering. It was his entire heart, held out in his calloused hand. Juniper looked at the marshal. She looked at the town. She looked at the man who had bought her, protected her, fought for her, and, finally, freed her. She did not speak. She walked the 3 steps to him. She took his hand, the strong one, the one that had held her in the storm. She laced her fingers, and the leather ring he had made, through his. "I'm staying," she whispered, her voice clear and sure. "I choose this, every day." Cassian's hand closed around hers, a grip of iron and relief. May Albright let out a small sob of pure joy. And from across the town, as if sensing the true end of the long nightmare, the bell of the Wheat Chapel began to ring, not in alarm, not in anger, but a slow, steady, peaceful chime, ringing out over the clean, quiet air of the Dry Arrow Basin. The rebuilding began with the smell of new-cut pine. The community had not forgotten them. Gideon Pike, his arm in a sling from the scuffle in the post office, arrived with a wagon load of fresh, pale lumber from the mill up north. He, Cassian, and 2 other ranchers whose land bordered the ridge worked for 3 solid days. The sound of hammering and sawing replaced the echo of gunfire. It was not a barn they were building. It was a different structure. It was stronger, built on deeper footings, with a low, sloping roof designed to spill the wind, not fight it. Juniper was not idle. She worked alongside them. She hauled water, turned the hand-cranked auger for the post holes, and handed up the shingles. Her hands, which had been scarred by iron, were now calloused by good wood. On the third day, as the sun was setting, Cassian was bracing the final crossbeam, the main support for the new roof. Juniper was on the ladder below him. "This is the last one," he said, his voice tired but satisfied. She looked at the beam. It was the heart of the structure. She took the small whittling knife from Cassian's belt. He watched her, his brow furrowed, as she began to carve into the soft pine. Her letters were not graceful, but they were deep and sure. When she was done, she handed the knife back. He read the words aloud, his rough finger tracing the carving. "Home is where you are trusted." He looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet wonder. He was quiet for a long time, watching the sun set over the ruined pasture. "Juniper," he said, his voice low. "That first day, in the street, when I told Maddox you were mine." She stopped, her hand on the ladder. "I didn't mean," he struggled, a man unused to the terrain of apologies. "I know what it sounded like. I know what they all thought, that I was just another man buying a thing." "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry for it," he said, the words costing him. "It was the only way I knew, to use the law against itself. I never meant to put another claim on you." Juniper looked up at him. He was silhouetted against the sky, a solid, decent man, afraid he had done the wrong thing for the right reason. She reached up and placed her hand on his boot, which was resting on the ladder rung. "You didn't buy me, Cassian," she said, her voice clear and sure. "They were dragging me to a locked gate, and you didn't have the key, so you bought the whole damn fence, just to give me the chance to walk through." She looked at the new beam, at her words. "You didn't buy me, you opened the door." He looked down at her, and the tightness that had lived in his shoulders for 20 years finally seemed to let go. The wedding was not a wedding. It was a promise, made public. It happened on the following Sunday. On the new-built porch of the house, Pastor Whitlow came, his good Bible in hand. May Albright came, bringing a basket with a fresh-baked apple and sage pie, and 3 jars of wildflowers. Gideon Pike came, and he set a new, gleaming anvil head by the porch as a gift. "For building," he said. There were no other guests, just the community that mattered. The sky was a sharp, aching blue. Pastor Whitlow did not read from the sections on law or judgment. He read a short piece about planting seeds in good soil. There was no wine. Cassian poured 4 tin cups of the strong, hot sage tea that Juniper had brewed. They raised their cups. "To the house," May said, her eyes shining. "To the fence," Gideon said, with a gruff smile. "To the ridge," Cassian said, his eyes on Juniper. "To the home," Juniper whispered. And they drank. That night, the house was quiet. The neighbors were gone. Tinder was asleep on his mat, his old legs twitching in a dream of chasing rabbits. The air was warm, and the high mesa stars were so bright they looked like holes punched in the sky, letting a brighter light leak through. Cassian was on the porch, just sitting, watching the night. Juniper came out. She stood beside him. Neither spoke. From inside, the faint scent of the apple pie and the last of the wood smoke made the air feel safe. "Cassian," she said softly. He turned. "Will you dance with me?" He looked confused. "There's no music." "There is," she said. She held out her hand. "Listen." He listened. He heard the high, thin song of the crickets, the shush of the wind moving through the pinon pines, the soft scrape of the new barn settling. It was the music of the ridge. It was their music. He stood up. He took her hand, his large, rough one swallowing hers. He put his other hand on the small of her back. She put her hand on his shoulder. And they danced. They moved slowly, their boots scraping softly on the hard-packed gravel of the yard. It was not a dance of grace. It was a dance of presence, a slow, circular affirmation. He pulled her closer. She rested her cheek against the rough flannel of his shirt, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. He rested his chin on the top of her head. They stopped moving and just stood there, holding each other in the starlight. He tilted her chin up. He looked at her, his eyes full of the starlight, and he kissed her. It was a long, slow, deep kiss. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. It was the taste of sage tea and wood smoke and a life. Finally, at peace. It was a vow, sealed without a word. The night wind was gentle, and it wrapped itself around them, a soft blanket. The cabin door was open, the faint golden lamplight spilling onto the porch, a warm and welcoming square. The night closed around them, and the house on Larkspur Ridge was, for the first time, truly full. A week later, a letter arrived from Silver Ledge, carried by a federal courier. Marshall Thorne was efficient. Burke Maddox, Eustace Hadley, and Orville Pike had been federally indicted. Their conspiracy, their corruption, their stampede, it was all going to trial, far from the county they had tried to own. They would not be coming back. The letter contained a second note. The Dry Arrow Basin, by public acclamation, had elected May Albright as the interim mayor and registrar. Her first act was to tear down the jail. Her second was to offer Gideon Pike the job of town sheriff. He had accepted. Change was not a fire. It was a planting. Juniper knew this. The following day, she took Cassian's carbine from the wall. She rode Winterglass not to the pass, but to town. She went to May. She did not return the rifle. She traded it. She traded the weapon for a crate of slate tablets, a box of chalk, and 6 copies of a McGuffey's Reader. In the old, abandoned livery, the one closest to the chapel, she nailed a new, hand-painted sign over the door. The Barnlight School. She started with 5 students. They were not children. They were women. The wives and daughters of ranchers from the high ridges. Women who had been taught to mend and cook, but not to read or write. May was her first student. They sat on old feed sacks. And Juniper, who had once been defined by a false document, taught them how to write their own names, how to spell truth, how to spell choice. Cassian, too, was planting. He took the small poke of seeds he'd been saving for 3 years, the ones he'd never had the heart or the hope to plant. He worked the soil along the new-built fence line, the one the community had helped him raise. He was planting flowers. He was planting larkspur. Old Tinder, his gray muzzle resting on his paws, lay in the sun, watching his master dig in the earth, not for survival, but for beauty. The old dog sighed, a sound of pure contentment, and slept in the warm, safe dirt. On the day the first blue-green shoots of larkspur broke the soil, Juniper walked out to the fence line. She was carrying something heavy. It was the chains, the ones Maddox had thrown in the dust, the ones Cassian had quietly retrieved and kept in the barn. As a reminder, she looked at the iron. They felt cold, dead. She picked a spot, right by the first, promising shoot of new life. She dug a hole, deep. She dropped the chains into the earth. She did not say a word. She just buried them. She filled the hole, tamping the earth down, burying the rust and the iron and the memory of the sound. She found a piece of scrap wood, a leftover from the new barn, and with her knife, she carved 4 words. She hammered the small, wooden stake into the ground above the buried chains. It was not a tombstone. It was a property line. It read, "Not for sale, not for taking." That evening, the sunset was a miracle. It was a deep, impossible crimson, bleeding into gold. It looked, Juniper thought, like red wine spilled across the sky. She and Cassian stood on the porch, watching it. He was leaning against the post. She was leaning against him. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. "It's good land," he whispered.
"It's our land," she replied.
He smiled, a slow, easy smile. He opened his eyes, and the red light of the sunset was reflected in them. "Tomorrow," he whispered, his promise, his vow. "I'll wake up, and I'll choose you again." She smiled back, her hand finding his, the leather ring a familiar, perfect fit. "And you." Far below them, at the edge of the basin where the main road came in, a new sign had been erected, paid for by the town council. Travelers, weary from the dust of the red-wined flats, would stop and read the new, clean letters, painted by Gideon Pike's steady hand. The sign read, "You are entering Dry Arrow Basin. If you were ever dragged, stop here, rest, walk on your own feet." The wind moved up the mesa. It passed over the new sign, over the quiet town, over the grave of the iron chains. It rustled through the new, strong shoots of the larkspur, which were just beginning to show their color. It was no longer a howl. It was a song. There was no sound of metal, no sound of rattling. There was only the sound of the tall grass, and the quiet, certain whisper of two people who had chosen each other. Today, and again, tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would be honored to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Please let us know in the comments, share your thoughts, and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting that hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.